Chapter 18 of Wodehouse in the Strand, Short Story Collection. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by P.J. Morgan. Wodehouse in the Strand, Short Story Collection by Pelham Grenville Wodehouse. Chapter 18. The Delayed Exit of Claude and Eustace. The feeling I had when Aunt Agatha trapped me in my lair that morning and spilled the bad news was that my luck had broken at last. As a rule, you see, I'm not lugged into family rows. On the occasions when Aunt is calling to Aunt like mastodons bellowing across primeval swamps, and Uncle James' letter about Cousin Mabel's peculiar behaviour is being shot round the family circle, "Please read this carefully and send it on to Jane," the clan has a tendency to ignore me. It's one of the advantages I get from being a bachelor, and, according to my nearest and dearest, practically a half-witted bachelor at that. "It's no good trying to get Bertie to take the slightest interest," is more or less the slogan, and I'm bound to say I'm all for it. A quiet life is what I like. And that's why I felt that the curse had come upon me, so to speak, when Aunt Agatha sailed into my sitting-room while I was having a placid cigarette and started to tell me about Claude and Eustace. I rather fancy I've touched on Claude and Eustace before in these little reminiscences of mine. My cousins, if you remember. Was at school with them when they were kids, and saved them from being sacked on no fewer than 3 separate occasions. Since they've been up at Oxford, I haven't seen so much of them, but what I have seen has been quite tolerably sufficient. Bright lads, mind you, but a trifle too much for a fellow like me who wants to jog along peacefully through life. "Thank goodness," said Aunt Agatha. "Arrangements have at last been made about Eustace and Claude." "Arrangements?" I said, not having the foggiest. "They sail on Friday for South Africa. Mr. Van Alstyne, a friend of poor Emily's, has given them berths in his firm at Johannesburg, and we are hoping that they will settle down there and do well." I didn't get the thing at all. "Friday? The day after tomorrow, do you mean?" "Yes." "For South Africa?" "Yes, they leave on the Edinburgh Castle." "But what's the idea? I mean, aren't they in the middle of their term at Oxford?" Aunt Agatha looked at me coldly. "Do you positively mean to tell me, Bertie, that you take so little interest in the affairs of your nearest relatives that you are not aware that Claude and Eustace were expelled from Oxford over a fortnight ago?" "No, really." "You are hopeless, Bertie. I should have thought that even you—
Why were they sent down?"
"They poured lemonade on the junior dean of their college. I see nothing amusing in the outrage, Bertie."
No, rather not," I said hurriedly. "I wasn't laughing. Joking. Got something stuck in my throat, you know."
"Poor Emily," went on Aunt Agatha. "Being one of those doting mothers who are the ruin of their children, wished to keep the boys in London. She suggested that they might cram for the army, but I was firm. The colonies are the only place for wild youth like Eustace and Claude. So they sail on Friday. They have been staying for the last 2 weeks with your Uncle Clive in Worcestershire. They will spend tomorrow night in London and catch the boat train on Friday morning."
"Bit risky, isn't it? I mean, aren't they apt to cut loose a bit tomorrow night if they're left all alone in London?"
"They will not be alone. They will be in your charge."
"Mine?"
"Yes. I wish you to put them up in your flat for the night, and see that they do not miss the train in the morning."
"Oh, I say, no."
"Bertie!"
"Well, I mean, quite jolly coves, both of them, but I don't know. They're rather nuts, you know. Always glad to see them, of course, but when it comes to putting them up for the night—"
"Bertie, if you are so sunk in callous self-indulgence that you cannot even put yourself to this trifling inconvenience for the sake of—"
"Oh, all right," I said, "all right." It was no good arguing, of course. Aunt Agatha always makes me feel as if I had gelatine where my spine ought to be. She's one of those forceful females. I should think Queen Elizabeth must have been something like her. When she holds me with her glittering eye and says, "Jump to it, my lad," or words to that effect. I make it so without further discussion. When she had gone, I rang for Jeeves to break the news to him. "Oh, Jeeves," I said, "Mr. Clodd and Mr. Eustace will be staying here tomorrow night."
"Very good, sir."
"I'm glad you think so. To me the outlook seems black and scaly. You know what those two lads are."
"Very high-spirited young gentlemen, sir."
"Blisters, Jeeves, undeniable blisters. It's a bit thick."
"Would there be anything further, sir?"
At that, I'm bound to say, I drew myself up a trifle haughtily. We Worcesters freeze like the Dickens when we seek sympathy and meet with cold reserve. I knew what was up, of course. For the last day or so there had been a certain amount of coolness in the home over a pair of jazz spats which I had dug up while exploring in the Burlington Arcade. Some dashed brainy cove, probably the chap who invented those coloured cigarette cases, had recently had the rather topping idea of putting out a line of spats on the same system. I mean to say, instead of the ordinary grey and white, you can now get them in your regimental or school colours. And believe me, it would have taken a chappie of stronger fibre than I am to resist the pair of old Etonian spats which had smiled up at me from inside the window. I was inside the shop, opening negotiations, before it had even occurred to me that Jeeves might not approve. And I must say he had taken the thing a bit hardly. The fact of the matter is, Jeeves, though in many ways the best valet in London, is too conservative, hidebound, if you know what I mean, and an enemy to progress. "Nothing further, Jeeves," I said with quiet dignity. "Very good, sir." He gave one frosty look at the spats and biffed off. Dash him! Anything merrier and brighter than the twins, when they curvetted into the old flat while I was dressing for dinner the next night, I have never struck in my whole puff. I'm only about half a dozen years older than Claude and Eustace, but in some rummy manner they always make me feel as if I were well on in the grandfather class, and just waiting for the end. Almost before I realised they were in the place, they had collared the best chairs, pinched a couple of my special cigarettes, poured themselves out a whisky and soda apiece, and started to prattle with the gaiety and abandon of two birds who had achieved their life's ambition instead of having come a most frightful purler and being under sentence of exile. "Hello, Bertie, old thing," said Claude. "Jolly decent of you to put us up." "Oh, no," I said, always the gentleman. "Only wish you were staying a good long time." "Hear that, Eustace? He wishes we were staying a good long time." "I expect it will seem a good long time," said Eustace philosophically. "You heard about the binge, Bertie? Our little bit of trouble, I mean." "Oh, yes, Aunt Agatha was telling me." "We leave our country for our country's good," said Eustace. "And let there be no moaning at the bar," said Claude. "When I put out to sea, what did Aunt Agatha tell you? She said you poured lemonade on the junior dean." "I wish the deuce," said Claude, annoyed, "that people would get these things right. It wasn't the junior dean, it was the senior tutor." "And it wasn't lemonade," said Eustace. "It was soda water. The dear old thing happened to be standing just under our window while I was leaning out with a siphon in my hand. He looked up and, well, it would have been chucking away the opportunity of a lifetime if I hadn't let him have it in the eyeball." "Simply chucking it away," agreed Claude. "Might never have occurred again," said Eustace. 100 to 1 against it," said Claude. "Now what," said Eustace, "do you propose to do, Bertie, in the way of entertaining the handsome guests tonight?" "My idea was to have a bite of dinner in the flat," I said. "Jeeves is getting it ready now." "And afterwards?" "Well, I thought we might chat of this and that, and then it struck me that you would probably like to turn in early, as your train goes about 10 or something, doesn't it?" The twins gazed at each other in a pitying sort of way. "Bertie," said Eustace, "you've got the programme nearly right, but not quite. I envisage the evening's events thus. We will toddle along to Ciro's after dinner. It's an extension night, isn't it? Well, that will see us through till about 2:30 or 3. After which, no doubt," said Claude, "the Lord will provide." But I thought you'd want to get a good night's rest."
"Good night's rest?" said Eustace. "My dear old chap, you don't for a moment imagine that we are dreaming of going to bed tonight, do you?" "I suppose the fact of the matter is, I'm not the man I was. I mean, these all-night vigils don't seem to fascinate me as they used to a few years ago. I can remember the time when I was up at Oxford, when a Covent Garden ball till 6 in the morning, with breakfast at the Hammonds, and probably a free fight with a few selected costermongers to follow, seemed to me what the doctor ordered. But nowadays 2 o'clock is about my limit, and by 2 o'clock the twins were just settling down and beginning to go nicely. As far as I can remember, we went on from Ciro's to play chemmy with some fellows I don't recall having met before, and it must have been about 9 in the morning when we fetched up again at the flat. By which time I'm bound to admit, as far as I was concerned, the first careless freshness was beginning to wear off a bit. In fact, I'd got just enough strength to say good-bye to the twins, wish them a pleasant voyage and a happy and successful career in South Africa, and stagger into bed. The last I remember was hearing the blighters chanting like larks under the cold shower, breaking off from time to shout to Jeeves to rush along the eggs and bacon. It must have been about 1 in the afternoon when I woke. I was feeling more or less like something the Pure Food Committee had rejected, but there was one bright thought which cheered me up, and that was that about now the twins would be leaning on the rail of the liner, taking their last glimpse of the dear old homeland, which made it all the more of a shock when the door opened and Claude walked in. "Hello, Bertie," said Claude. "Had a nice refreshing sleep? Now, what about a good old bite of lunch?" I'd been having so many distorted nightmares since I had dropped off to sleep that for half a minute I thought this was simply one more of them, and the worst of the lot. It was only when Claude sat down on my feet that I got on to the fact that this was stern reality. "Great Scott! What on earth are you doing here?" I gurgled. Claude looked at me reproachfully. "Hardly the tone I like to hear in a host, Bertie," he said reprovingly. "Why, it was only last night that you were saying you wished I was stopping a good long time. Your dream has come true, I am. But why aren't you on your way to South Africa?" "Now that," said Claude, "is a point I rather thought you would want to have explained. It's like this, old man. You remember that girl you introduced me to at Ciro's last night?" "Which girl?" "There was only one," said Claude coldly. "Only one that counted, that is to say. Her name was Marion Wardour. I danced with her a good deal, if you remember." I began to recollect in a hazy sort of way. Marion Wardour has been a pal of mine for some time. A very good sort. She's playing in that show at the Apollo at the moment. I remembered now that she had been at Ciro's with a party the night before, and the twins had insisted on being introduced. "We are soul-mates, Bertie," said Claude. "I found it out quite early in the PM, and the more thought I've given to the matter, the more convinced I've become. It happens like that now and then, you know. 2 hearts that beat as one, I mean, and all that sort of thing. So the long and the short of it is that I gave old Eustace the slip at Waterloo and slid back here. The idea of going to South Africa and leaving a girl like that in England doesn't appeal to me a bit. I'm all for thinking imperially and giving the colonies a leg up and all that sort of thing, but it can't be done. After all," said Claude reasonably, "South Africa has got along all right without me up till now, so why shouldn't it stick it?" "But what about Van Alstyne, or whatever his name is? He'll be expecting you to turn up." "Oh, he'll have Eustace. That'll satisfy him. Very sound fellow, Eustace. Probably end up by being a magnate of some kind. I shall watch his future progress with considerable interest. And now you must excuse me for a moment, Bertie. I want to go and hunt up Jeeves and get him to mix me one of those pick-me-ups of his. For some reason which I can't explain, I've got a slight headache this morning." And believe me or believe me not, the door had hardly closed behind him, when in blew Eustace with a shining morning face that made me ill to look at. "Oh, my aunt," I said. Eustace started to giggle pretty freely. "Smooth work, Bertie, smooth work," he said. "I'm sorry for poor old Claude, but there was no alternative.
I eluded his vigilance at Waterloo and snaked off in a taxi. I suppose the poor old ass is wondering where the deuce I've got to. But it couldn't be helped. If you really seriously expected me to go slogging off to South Africa, you shouldn't have introduced me to Miss Wardour last night. I want to tell you all about that, Bertie. I'm not a man, said Eustace, sitting down on the bed, who falls in love with every girl he sees. I suppose strong, silent would be the best description you could find for me, but when I do meet my affinity, I don't waste time. Oh, heavens, are you in love with Marion Wardour too? Too? What do you mean, too? I was going to tell him about Claude, when the blighter came in person, looking like a giant refreshed. There's no doubt that Jeeves' pick-me-ups will produce immediate results in anything short of an Egyptian mummy. It's something he puts in them, the Worcester sauce or something. Claude had revived like a watered flower, but he nearly had a relapse when he saw his bally brother goggling at him over the bed-rail. "What on earth are you doing here?" he said. "What on earth are you doing here?" said Eustace. "Have you come back to inflict your beastly society upon Miss Wardour? Is that why you've come back?" They thrashed the subject out a bit further. "Well," said Claude, at last, "I suppose it can't be helped. If you're here, you're here. May the best man win." "Yes, but dash it all," I managed to put in at this point. "What's the idea? Where do you think you're going to stay if you stick on in London?" "Why, here," said Eustace, surprised. "Where else?" said Claude, raising his eyebrows. "You won't object to putting us up, Bertie?" said Eustace. "Not a sportsman like you," said Claude. "But you silly asses, suppose Aunt Agatha finds out that I'm hiding you when you ought to be in South Africa. Where do I get off?" "Where does he get off?" Claude asked Eustace. "Oh, I expect he'll manage somehow," said Eustace to Claude. "Of course," said Claude, quite cheered up. "He'll manage." "Rather," said Eustace. "A resourceful chap like Bertie, of course he will." "And now," said Claude, shelving the subject, "what about that bite of lunch we were discussing a moment ago, Bertie? That stuff good old Jeeves slipped into me just now has given me what you might call an appetite. Something in the nature of 6 chops and a batter pudding would about meet the case, I think." I suppose every chappie in the world has black periods in his life to which he can't look back without the smouldering eye and the silent shudder. Some coves, if you can judge by the novels you read nowadays, have them practically all the time. But what with enjoying a sizable private income and a topping digestion, I'm bound to say it isn't very often I find my own existence getting a flat tire. That's why this particular epoch is one that I don't think about more often than I can help. For the days that followed the unexpected resurrection of the blighted twins were so absolutely foul that the old nerves began to stick out of my body a foot long and curling at the ends. Oliver Twitter, believe me. I imagine the fact of the matter is that we Worcesters are so frightfully honest and open and all that it gives us the pip to have to deceive. All was quiet along the Potomac for about 24 hours, and then Aunt Agatha trickled in to have a chat. 20 minutes earlier, and she would have found the twins gaily shoving themselves outside a couple of rashers and an egg. She sank into a chair, and I could see that she was not in her usual sunny spirits. "Bertie," she said, "I am uneasy." So was I. I didn't know how long she intended to stop, or when the twins were coming back. "I wonder," she said, "if I took too harsh a view towards Claude and Eustace?" "You couldn't." "What do you mean?" I mean it would be so unlike you to be harsh to anybody, Aunt Agatha. And not bad, either. I mean quick, like that, without thinking. It pleased the old relative, and she looked at me with slightly less loathing than she usually does. "It is nice of you to say that, Bertie, but what I was thinking was, are they safe?" "Are they what?" It seemed such a rummy adjective to apply to the twins, they being about as innocuous as a couple of sprightly young tarantulas. "Do you think all is well with them?" "How do you mean?" Aunt Agatha eyed me almost wistfully. "Has it ever occurred to you, Bertie," she said, "that your Uncle George may be psychic?" She seemed to me to be changing the subject. "Psychic?" "Do Do you think it possible that he could see things not visible to the normal eye?
I thought it dashed possible, if not probable. I don't know if you've ever met my Uncle George. He's a festive old egg who wanders from club to club, continually having a couple with other festive old eggs. When he heaves in sight, waiters brace themselves up, and the wine steward toys with his corkscrew. It was my Uncle George who discovered that alcohol was a food, well in advance of modern medical thought.
Your Uncle George was dining with me last night, and he was quite shaken. He declares that, while on his way from the Devonshire Club to Boodle's, he suddenly saw the phantasm of Eustace.
The what of Eustace?
The phantasm, the wraith. It was so clear that he thought for an instant that it was Eustace himself. The figure vanished round a corner, and when Uncle George got there nothing was to be seen. It is all very queer and disturbing. It had a marked effect on poor George. All through dinner he touched nothing but barley water, and his manner was quite disturbed. You do think those poor dear boys are safe, Bertie? They have not met with some horrible accident?
It made my mouth water to think of it, but I said no. I didn't think they had met with any horrible accident. I thought Eustace was a horrible accident, and Claude about the same, but I didn't say so, and presently she biffed off, still worried. When the twins came in, I put it squarely to the blighters. Jolly as it was to give Uncle George shocks, they must not wander at large about the Metrop.
"But, my dear old soul," said Claude, "be reasonable. We can't have our movements hampered." "Out of the question," said Eustace. "The whole essence of the thing, if you understand me," said Claude, "is that we should be at liberty to flit hither and thither." "Exactly," said Eustace. "Now hither, now thither." "But, damn it, Bertie," said Eustace reprovingly, "not before the boy." "Of course, in a way I see his point," said Claude. "I suppose the solution of the problem would be to buy a couple of disguises." "My dear old chap," said Eustace, looking at him with admiration, "the brightest idea on record. Not your own, surely?" "Well, as a matter of fact, it was Bertie who put it into my head." "Me?" "You were telling me the other day about old Bingo Little and the beard he bought when he didn't want his uncle to recognise him." "If you think I'm going to have you two excrescences popping in and out of my flat in beards—" "Something in that," agreed Eustace. "We'll make it whiskers, then." "And false noses," said Claude. "And as you say, false noses. Right-ho, then, Bertie, old chap, that's a load off your mind. We don't want to be any trouble to you while we're paying you this little visit." And when I went buzzing round to Jeeves for consolation, all he would say was something about young blood, no sympathy. "Very good, Jeeves," I said. "I shall go for a walk in the park. Kindly put me out the old Etonian spats." "Very good, sir." It must have been a couple of days after that Marion Wardour rolled in at about the hour of tea. She looked warily round the room before sitting down. "Your cousins not at home, Bertie?" she said. "No, thank goodness." "Then I'll tell you where they are. They're in my sitting-room, glaring at each other from opposite corners, waiting for me to come in. Bertie, this has got to stop." "You're seeing a good deal of them, are you?" Jeeves came in with the tea, but the poor girl was so worked up that she didn't wait for him to pop off before going on with her complaint. She had an absolutely hunted air, poor thing. "I can't move a step without tripping over one or both of them," she said. "Generally both. They've taken to calling together, and they just settle down grimly and try to sit each other out. It's wearing me to a shadow." "I know," I said sympathetically. "I know." "Well, what's to be done?" "It beats me. Couldn't you tell your maid to say you were not at home?" She shuddered slightly. "I tried that once. They camped on the stairs, and I couldn't get out all the afternoon, and I had a lot of particularly important engagements. I wish you would persuade them to go to South Africa, where they seem to be wanted." "You must have made the dickens of an impression on them." "I should say I have. They've started giving me presents now. At least Claude has. He insisted on my accepting this cigarette case last night. Came round to the theatre and wouldn't go away till I took it. It's not a bad one, I must say." It wasn't. It was a distinctly fruity concern in gold with a diamond stuck in the middle,
And the rummy thing was that I had a notion I'd seen something very like it before somewhere. How the deuce Claude had been able to dig up the cash to buy a thing like that was more than I could imagine. Next day was a Wednesday, and as the object of their devotion had a matinee, the twins were, so to speak, off duty. Claude had gone with his whiskers on to Hurst Park, and Eustace and I were in the flat talking. At least he was talking, and I was wishing he would go.
"The love of a good woman, Bertie," he was saying, "must be a wonderful thing. Sometimes... Good Lord, what's that?"
The front door had opened, and from out in the hall there came the sound of Aunt Agatha's voice asking if I was in. Aunt Agatha has one of those high, penetrating voices, but this was the first time I'd ever been thankful for it. There was just about 2 seconds to clear the way for her, but it was long enough for Eustace to dive under the sofa. His last shoe had just disappeared when she came in. She had a worried look. It seemed to me about this time that everybody had.
"Bertie," she said, "what are your immediate plans?"
"How do you mean? I'm dining tonight with—"
No, I don't mean tonight. Are you busy for the next few days? But of course you are not," she went on, not waiting for me to answer. "You never have anything to do. Your whole life is spent in idle... But we can go into that later. What I came for this afternoon was to tell you that I wish you to go with your poor Uncle George to Harrogate for a few weeks. The sooner you can start, the better."
This appeared to me to approximate so closely to the frozen limit that I uttered a yelp of protest. Uncle George is all right, but he won't do. I was trying to say as much when she waved me down.
"If you are not entirely heartless, Bertie, you will do as I ask you. Your poor Uncle George has had a severe shock."
"What, another?"
"He feels that only complete rest and careful medical attendance can restore his nervous system to its normal poise. It seems that in the past he has derived benefit from taking the waters at Harrogate, and he wishes to go there now. We do not think he ought to be alone, so I wish you to accompany him."
"But I say—"
"Bertie!"
There was a lull in the conversation. "What shock has he had?" I asked.
"Between ourselves,"
said Aunt Agatha, lowering her voice in an impressive manner,
"I incline to think that the whole affair was the outcome of an overexcited imagination. You are one of the family, Bertie, and I can speak freely to you. You know as well as I do that your poor Uncle George has for many years not been he has developed a habit of, how shall I put it?"
"Shifting it a bit."
"I beg your pardon?"
"Mopping up the stuff to some extent."
"I dislike your way of putting it exceedingly, but I must confess that he has not been, perhaps, as temperate as he should. He is highly strung, and, well, the fact is that he has had a shock."
"Yes, but what?"
"That is what is so hard to induce him to explain with any precision. With all his good points, your poor Uncle George is apt to become incoherent when strongly moved. As far as I could gather, he appears to have been the victim of a burglary."
"Burglary?"
"He says that a strange man with whiskers and a peculiar nose entered his rooms in Jermyn Street during his absence and stole some of his property. He says that he came back and found the man in his sitting-room. He immediately rushed out of the room and disappeared."
"Uncle George?"
"No, the man. And, according to your Uncle George, he had stolen a valuable cigarette case. But, as I say, I am inclined to think that the whole thing was imagination. He has not been himself since the day when he fancied that he saw Eustace in the street. So I should like you, Bertie, to be prepared to start for Harrogate with him not later than Saturday."
She popped off, and Eustace crawled out from under the sofa. The blight was strongly moved. So was I, for the matter of that. The idea of several weeks with Uncle George at Harrogate seemed to make everything go black.
"So that's where he got that cigarette case, dash him!"
said Eustace bitterly.
"Of all the dirty tricks! Robbing his own flesh and blood! The fellow ought to be in chokey."
"He ought to be in South Africa," I said, "and so ought you." And with an eloquence which rather surprised me, I hauled up my slacks for perhaps 10 minutes on the subject of his duty to his family and what not. I appealed to his sense of decency.
I boosted South Africa with vim. I said everything I could think of, much of it twice over. But all the blighter did was to babble about his dashed brother's baseness in putting one over on him in the matter of the cigarette case. He seemed to think that Claude, by slinging in the handsome gift, had got right ahead of him, and there was a painful scene when the latter came back from Hurst Park. I could hear them talking half the night, long after I had tottered off to bed. I don't know when I've met fellows who could do with less sleep than those two. After this, things became a bit strained at the flat, owing to Claude and Eustace not being on speaking terms. I'm all for a certain chumminess in the home, and it was wearing to have to live with two fellows who wouldn't admit that the other one was on the map at all. One felt the thing couldn't go on like that for long, and by Jove, it didn't. But if anyone had come to me the day before and told me what was going to happen, I should simply have smiled wanly. I mean, I've got so accustomed to thinking that nothing short of a dynamite explosion could ever dislodge those two nestlers from my midst that, when Claude sidled up to me on the Friday morning and told me his bit of news, I could hardly believe I was hearing right. "Bertie," he said, "I've been thinking it over." "What over?" I said. "The whole thing. This business of staying in London when I ought to be in South Africa. It isn't fair," said Claude, warmly. "It isn't right. And the long and the short of it is, Bertie, old man, I'm leaving tomorrow." I reeled in my tracks. "You are?" I gasped. "Yes, if," said Claude, "you won't mind sending old Jeeves out to buy a ticket for me. I'm afraid I'll have to stick you for the passage money, old man. You don't mind?" "Mind?" I said, clutching his hand fervently. "That's all right, then. Oh, I say, you won't say a word to Eustace about this, will you?" "But isn't he going too?" Claude shuddered. "No, thank heaven. The idea of being cooped up on board a ship with that blighter gives me the pip just to think of it. No, not a word to Eustace. I say, I suppose you can get me a berth all right at such short notice." "Rather," I said. "Sooner than let this opportunity slip, I would have bought the bally boat." "Jeeves," I said, breezing into the kitchen, "go out on first speed to the Union Castle offices and book a berth on tomorrow's boat for Mr. Claude. He is leaving us, Jeeves." "Yes, sir." "Mr. Claude does not wish any mention of this to be made to Mr. Eustace." "No, sir. Mr. Eustace made the same proviso when he desired me to obtain a berth on tomorrow's boat for himself." I gaped at the man. "Is he going too?" "Yes, sir." "This is rummy." "Yes, sir." Had circumstances been other than they were, I would at this juncture have unbent considerably towards Jeeves, frisked round him a bit and whooped to a certain extent and what not. But those spats still formed a barrier, and I regret to say that I took the opportunity of rather rubbing it in a bit on the man. I mean, he'd been so dashed aloof and unsympathetic, though perfectly aware that the young master was in the soup, and that it was up to him to rally round, that I couldn't help pointing out how the happy ending had been snaffled without any help from him. "So that's that, Jeeves," I said. "The episode is concluded. I knew things would sort themselves out if one gave them time and didn't get rattled. Many chaps in my place would have got rattled, Jeeves." "Yes, sir." "Gone rushing about, I mean, asking people for help and advice and so forth." "Very possibly, sir." "But not me, Jeeves." "No, sir." I left him to brood on it. Even the thought that I'd got to go to Harrogate with Uncle George couldn't depress me that Saturday, when I gazed about the old flat and realised that Claude and Eustace weren't in it. They had slunk off stealthily and separately immediately after breakfast, Eustace to catch the boat train at Waterloo, Claude to go round to the garage where I kept my car. I didn't want any chance of the two meeting at Waterloo and changing their minds, so I had suggested to Claude that he might find it pleasanter to drive down to Southampton. I was lying back on the old settee, gazing peacefully up at the flowers on the ceiling and feeling what a wonderful world this was, when Jeeves came in with a letter. "A messenger boy has brought this, sir." I opened the envelope, and the first thing that fell out was a £5 note. "Great Scott!" I said. "What's all this?" The letter was scribbled in pencil and was quite brief. "Dear Bertie, will you give enclosed to your man and tell him I wish I could make it more? He has saved my life. This is the first happy day I've had for a week. Yours, M.W. Jeeves was standing holding out the fiver, which had fluttered to the floor. "You'd better stick to it," I said. "It seems to be for you." "Sir?" "I say that fiver is for you, apparently. Miss Wardour sent it." "That was extremely kind of her, sir." "What the dickens is she sending you fivers for? She says you saved her life." Jeeves smiled gently. "She overestimates my services, sir." "But what were your services, dash it?" "It was in the matter of Mr. Claude and Mr. Eustace, sir. I was hoping that you would not refer to the matter, as I did not wish you to think that I had been taking a liberty." "What do you mean?" "I chanced to be in the room while Miss Wardour was complaining with some warmth of the manner in which Mr. Claude and Mr. Eustace were thrusting their society upon her. I felt that in the circumstances it might be excusable if I suggested a slight ruse to enable her to dispense with their attentions." "Good Lord! You don't mean to say you were at the bottom of their popping off, after all? Silly ass it made me feel. I mean, after rubbing it into him like that about having clicked without his assistance." It occurred to me that, were Miss Wardour to inform Mr. Claude and Mr. Eustace independently that she proposed sailing for South Africa to take up a theatrical engagement, the desired effect might be produced. It appears that my anticipations were correct, sir. The young gentleman ate it, if I may use the expression." "Jeeves," I said, "we Woosters may make bloomers, but we are never too proud to admit it. You stand alone." "Thank you very much, sir." "Oh, but I say—" A ghastly thought had struck me. "When they get on the boat and find she isn't there, won't they come buzzing back?" "I anticipated that possibility, sir. At my suggestion, Miss Wardour informed the young gentleman that she proposed to travel overland to Madeira and join the vessel there."
"And where do they touch after Madeira?"
"Nowhere, sir."
For a moment I just lay back, letting the idea of the thing soak in. There seemed to me to be only one flaw. "The only pity is," I said, "that on a large boat like that they will be able to avoid each other. I mean, I should have liked to feel that Claude was having a good deal of Eustace's society, and vice versa."
"I fancy that will be so, sir. I secured a 2-berth stateroom. Mr. Claude will occupy one berth, Mr. Eustace the other."
I sighed with pure ecstasy. It seemed a dashed shame that on this joyful occasion I should have to go off to Harrogate with my Uncle George. "Have you started packing yet, Jeeves?" I asked.
"Packing, sir?"
"For Harrogate. I've got to go there today with Sir George."
"Of course, yes, sir. I forgot to mention it. Sir George rang up on the telephone this morning while you were still asleep, and said that he had changed his plans. He does not intend to go to Harrogate."
"Oh, I say, how absolutely topping!"
"I thought you might be pleased, sir."
"What made him change his plans? Did he say?"
"No, sir, but I gather from his man, Stevens, that he is feeling much better and does not now require a rest cure. I took the liberty of giving Stevens the recipe for that pick-me-up of mine, of which you have always approved so much. Stevens tells me that Sir George informed him this morning that he is feeling a new man."
"Well, there was only one thing to do, and I did it. I'm not saying it didn't hurt, but there was no alternative." "Jeeves," I said, "those spats—"
"Yes, sir."
"You really dislike them?"
"Intensely, sir."
"You don't think time might induce you to change your views?"
"No, sir."
"All right, then. Very well. Say no more. You may burn them."
"Thank you very much, sir. I have already done so. Before breakfast this morning. A quiet grey is far more suitable, sir. Thank you, sir."
End of chapter 18. Recording by P.J. Morgan. Find me online at listentopj.com.
Chapter 19 of Wodehouse in the Strand, Short Story Collection. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Asterix. Wodehouse in the Strand, short story collection by Pelham Grenville Wodehouse. Chapter 19, The Magic +4s. "After all," said the young man, "golf's only a game." He spoke bitterly, and with the air of one who has been following a train of thought. He had come into the smoking-room of the club-house in low spirits at the dusky close of a November evening, and for some minutes had been sitting, silent and moody, staring at the log fire. "Merely a pastime," said the young man. The oldest member, nodding in his armchair, stiffened with horror, and glanced quickly over his shoulder to make sure that none of the waiters had heard these terrible words. "Can this be George William Pennefather speaking?" he said reproachfully. "My boy, you are not yourself." The young man flushed a little beneath his tan, for he had had a good upbringing and was not bad at heart. "Perhaps I ought not to have gone quite so far as that," he admitted. "I was only thinking that a fellow's got no right, just because he happens to have come on a bit in his form lately, to treat a fellow as if a fellow was a leper or something." The oldest member's face cleared, and he breathed a relieved sigh. "Ah, I see," he said. "You spoke hastily and in a sudden fit of pique, because something upset you out on the links today. Tell me all. Let me see. You were playing with Nathaniel Frisby this afternoon, were you not? I gather that he beat you." "Yes, he did, giving me a third. But it isn't being beaten that I mind. What I object to is having the blighter behave as if he were a sort of champion, condescending to a mere mortal. Dash it, it seemed to bore him playing with me. Every time I sliced off the tee he looked at me as if I were a painful ordeal. Twice, when I was having a bit of trouble in the bushes, I caught him yawning. And after we had finished he started talking about what a good game croquet was, and he wondered more people didn't take it up, and it's only a month or so ago that I could play the man level." The oldest member shook his snowy head sadly. "There is nothing to be done about it," he said. "We can only hope that the poison will in time work its way out of the man's system. Sudden success at golf is like the sudden acquisition of wealth. It is apt to unsettle and deteriorate the character, and as it comes almost miraculously, so only a miracle can effect a cure. The best advice I can give you is to refrain from playing with Nathaniel Frisby till you can keep your tee shots straight." "Oh, but don't run away with the idea that I wasn't pretty good off the tee this afternoon," said the young man. "I should like to describe to you the shot I did on the—" "Meanwhile," proceeded the oldest member, "I will relate to you a little story which bears on what I have been saying from the moment I addressed the ball. It is the story of two loving hearts temporarily estranged owing to the sudden and unforeseen proficiency of one of the couple. I waggled quickly and strongly, like Duncan, then swinging smoothly back rather in the Varden manner." "But I see," said the oldest member, "that you are all impatience for me to begin. I will do so without further preamble. To the philosophical student of golf, like myself," said the oldest member, "perhaps the most outstanding virtue of this noble pursuit is the fact that it is a medicine for the soul. Its great service to humanity is that it teaches human beings that, whatever petty triumphs they may have achieved in other walks of life, they are, after all, merely human. It acts as a corrective against sinful pride. I attribute the insane arrogance of the later Roman emperors almost entirely to the fact that, never having played golf, they never knew that strange, chastening humility which is engendered by a topped chip shot. If Cleopatra had been outed in the first round of the ladies' singles, we should have heard a lot less of her proud imperiousness. And, coming down to modern times, it was undoubtedly his rotten golf that kept Wallace Chesney the nice, unspoiled fellow that he was. For in every other respect he had everything in the world calculated to make a man conceited and arrogant. He was the best-looking man for miles around, his health was perfect, and in addition to this he was rich, danced, rode, played bridge and polo with equal skill, and was engaged to be married to Charlotte Dix. And when you saw Charlotte Dix, you realized that being engaged to her would by itself have been quite enough luck for any one man. But Wallace, as I say, despite all his advantages, was a thoroughly nice, modest young fellow, and I attribute this to the fact that, while one of the keenest golfers in the club, he was also one of the worst players. Indeed, Charlotte Dix used to say to me in his presence that she could not understand why people paid money to go to the circus when, by merely walking over the brow of a hill, they could watch Wallace Chesney trying to get out of the bunker by the 11th green. And Wallace took the jibe with perfect good humour, for there was a delightful camaraderie between them which robbed it of any sting. Often at lunch in the clubhouse I used to hear him and Charlotte planning the handicapping details of a proposed match between Wallace and a non-existent cripple whom Charlotte claimed to have discovered in the village. It being agreed finally that he should accept 7 bisques from the cripple, but that if the latter ever recovered the use of his arms, Wallace should get a stroke a hole. In short, a thoroughly happy and united young couple, 2 hearts, if I may coin an expression, that beat as one. I would not have you misjudge Wallace Chesney. I may have given you the impression that his attitude towards golf was light and frivolous, but such was not the case. As I have said, he was one of the keenest members of the club. Love made him receive the joshing of his fiancée in the kindly spirit in which it was meant. But at heart he was as earnest as you could wish. He practised early and late. He bought golf books, and the mere sight of a patent club of any description acted on him like catnip on a cat. I remember remonstrating with him on the occasion of his purchasing a wooden-faced driving mashie which weighed about 2 pounds, and was, taking it for all in all, as foul an instrument as ever came out of the workshop of a club-maker who had been dropped on the head by his nurse when a baby. I know," he said, when I had finished indicating some of the weapon's more obvious defects. "But the point is, I believe in it. It gives me confidence. I don't believe you could slice with a thing like that if you tried." Confidence! That was what Wallace Chesney lacked, and that, as he saw it, was the prime grand secret of golf. Like an alchemist on the track of the philosopher's stone, he was for ever seeking for something which would really give him confidence. I recollect that he even tried repeating to himself 50 times every morning the words, "Every day in every way I grow better and better." This, however, proved such a black lie that he gave it up. The fact is, the man was a visionary, and it is to auto-hypnosis of some kind that I attribute the extraordinary change that came over him at the beginning of his 3rd season. You may have noticed in your perambulations about the city a shop bearing above its door and upon its windows the legend, "Cohen Brothers, Second-Hand Clothiers," a statement which is borne out by endless vistas seen through the door of every variety of what is technically known as gents' wear. But the brothers Cohen, though their main stock in trade is garments which have been rejected by their owners for one reason or another, do not confine their dealings to gents' wear. The place is a museum of derelict goods of every description. You can get a second-hand revolver there, or a second-hand sword, or a second-hand umbrella. You can do a cheap deal in field glasses, trunks, dog collars, canes, photograph frames, attaché cases, and bowls for goldfish. And on the bright spring morning when Wallace Chesney happened to pass by, there was exhibited in the window a putter of such preeminently lunatic design that he stopped dead, as if he had run into an invisible wall, and then, panting like an overwrought fish, charged in through the door. The shop was full of the Cohen family, sombre-eyed, smileless men with purposeful expressions, and two of these, instantly descending upon Wallace Chesney like leopards, began in swift silence to thrust him into a suit of yellow tweed. Having worked the coat over his shoulders with a shoehorn, they stood back to watch the effect. "A beautiful fit," announced Isidore Cohen. "A little snug under the arms," said his brother Irving, "but that'll give." "The warmth of the body will make it give," said Isidore. "Or maybe you'll lose weight in the summer," said Irving. Wallace, when he had struggled out of the coat and was able to breathe, said that he had come in to buy a putter. Isidore thereupon sold him the putter, a dog collar, and a set of studs, and Irving sold him a fireman's helmet, and he was about to leave when their elder brother Lou, who had just finished fitting out another customer who had come in to buy a cap, with 2 pairs of trousers and a miniature aquarium for keeping newts in, saw that business was in progress and strolled up. His fathomless eye rested on Wallace, who was toying feebly with the putter. "You play golf?" asked Lou. "Then look-a-here." He dived into an alleyway of dead clothing, dug for a moment, and emerged with something at the sight of which Wallace Chesney, hardened golfer that he was, blenched, and threw up an arm defensively. "No, no!" he cried. The object, which Lou Cohen was waving insinuatingly before his eyes, was a pair of those golfing breeches which are technically known as +4s. A player of 2 years' standing, Wallace Chesney was not unfamiliar with +4s. All the club cracks wore them, but he had never seen +4s like these. What might be termed the main motif of the fabric was a curious, vivid pink, and with this to work on the architect had let his imagination run free, and had produced so much variety in the way of chessboard squares of white, yellow, violet, and green, that the eye swam as it looked upon them. "These were made to measure for Sandy McHoots, the Open champion," said Lou, stroking the left leg lovingly, "but he sent 'em back for some reason or other." "Perhaps they frightened the children," said Wallace, recollecting having heard that McHoots was a married man. "They'll fit you nice," said Lou. "Sure, they'll fit him nice," said Isidore warmly. "Why, just take a look at yourself in the glass," said Irving, "and see if they don't fit you nice." And as one who wakes from a trance, Wallace discovered that his lower limbs were now encased in the prismatic garment. At what point in the proceedings the brethren had slipped them on him he could not have said, but he was undeniably in. Wallace looked in the glass. For a moment, as he eyed his reflection, sheer horror gripped him. Then, suddenly, as he gazed, he became aware that his first feelings were changing. The initial shock over, he was becoming calmer. He waggled his right leg with a certain sang-froid. There is a certain passage in the works of the poet Pope with which you may be familiar. It runs as follows: "Vice is a monster of so frightful mien, as to be hated needs but to be seen. Yet so too oft, familiar with her face, we first endure, then pity, then embrace." Even so was it with Wallace Chesney and these +4s. At first he had recoiled from them as any decent-minded man would have done. Then, after a while, almost abruptly, he found himself in the grip of a new emotion. After an unsuccessful attempt to analyze this, he suddenly got it. Amazing as it may seem, it was pleasure that he felt. He caught his eye in the mirror, and it was smirking. Now that the things were actually on, by Hutchinson, they didn't look half bad. By Braid, they didn't. There was a sort of something about them. Take away that expanse of bare leg with its unsightly sock suspender and substitute a woolly stocking, and you would have the lower section of a golfer. For the first time in his life, he thought, he looked like a man who could play golf. There came to him an odd sensation of masterfulness. He was still holding the putter, and now he swung it up above his shoulder. A fine swing, all lissomeness and supple grace, quite different from any swing he had ever done before. Wallace Chesney gasped. He knew that at last he had discovered that prime grand secret of golf for which he had searched so long. It was the costume that did it. All he had to do was wear +4s. He had always hitherto played in grey flannel trousers. Naturally, he had not been able to do himself justice. Golf required an easy dash, and how could you be easily dashing in concertina-shaped trousers with a patch on the knee? He saw now what he had never seen before, that it was not because they were crack players that crack players wore +4s. It was because they wore +4s that they were crack players, and these +4s had been the property of an Open champion. Wallace Chesney's bosom swelled, and he was filled, as by some strange gas, with joy, with excitement, with confidence. Yes, for the first time in his golfing life he felt really confident. True, the things might have been a shade less gaudy. They might perhaps have hit the eye with a slightly less violent punch. But what of that? True, again, he could scarcely hope to avoid the censure of his clubmates when he appeared like this on the links. But what of that? His clubmates must set their teeth and learn to bear these +4s like men. That was what Wallace Chesney thought about it. If they did not like his +4s, let them go and play golf somewhere else. How much? He muttered thickly, and the brothers Cohen clustered grimly round with notebooks and pencils. In predicting a stormy reception for his new apparel, Wallace Chesney had not been unduly pessimistic. The moment he entered the clubhouse, disaffection reared its ugly head. Friends of years' standing called loudly for the committee, and there was a small and vehement party of the left wing, headed by Raymond Gandel, who was an artist by profession and consequently had a sensitive eye, which advocated the tearing off and public burial of the obnoxious garment, but, prepared as he had been for some such demonstration on the part of the coarser-minded, Wallace had hoped for better things when he should meet Charlotte Dix, the girl who loved him. Charlotte, he had supposed, would understand and sympathize. Instead of which she uttered a piercing cry and staggered to a bench, whence a moment later she delivered her ultimatum. "Quick," she said, "before I have to look again." "What do you mean?" "Pop straight back into the changing-room while I've got my eyes shut, and remove the fancy dress." "What's wrong with them?" "Darling," said Charlotte, "I think it's sweet and patriotic of you to be proud of your cycling club colours, or whatever they are, but you mustn't wear them on the links. It will unsettle the caddies." "They are a trifle on the bright side," admitted Wallace, "but it helps my game wearing them. I was trying a few practice shots just now, and I couldn't go wrong. Slammed the ball on the meat every time. They inspire me, if you know what I mean. Come on, let's be starting." Charlotte opened her eyes incredulously. "You can't seriously mean that you're really going to play in those? It's against the rules. There must be a rule somewhere in the book against coming out looking like a sunset. Won't you go and burn them for my sake?" But I tell you they give me confidence. I sort of squint down at them when I'm addressing the ball, and I feel like a pro. Then the only thing to do is for me to play you for them. Come on, Wally, be a sportsman. I'll give you a half and play you for the whole outfit, the breeches, the red jacket, the little cap, and the belt with the snake's head buckle. I'm sure all those things must have gone with the breeches. Is it a bargain?" Strolling on the clubhouse terrace some 2 hours later, Raymond Gandel encountered Charlotte and Wallace coming up from the 18th green. "Just the girl I wanted to see," said Raymond. "Miss Dix, I represent a select committee of my fellow members, and I have come to ask you on their behalf to use the influence of a good woman to induce Wally to destroy those +4s of his, which we all consider nothing short of Bolshevik propaganda and a menace to the public weal. May I rely on you?" "You may not," retorted Charlotte. "They are the poor boy's mascot. You've no idea how they have improved his game. He has just beaten me hollow. I am going to try to learn to bear them, so you must. Really, you've no notion how he has come on. My cripple won't be able to give him more than a couple of bisques if he keeps up this form." "It's something about the things," said Wallace. "They give me confidence." "They give me a pain in the neck," said Raymond Gandel. To the thinking man, nothing is more remarkable in this life than the way in which humanity adjusts itself to conditions which at their outset might well have appeared intolerable. Some great cataclysm occurs, some storm or earthquake, shaking the community to its foundations, and after the first pardonable consternation, one finds the sufferers resuming their ordinary pursuits as if nothing had happened. There have been few more striking examples of this adaptability than the behavior of the members of our golf club under the impact of Wallace Chesney's +4s. For the first few days it is not too much to say that they were stunned. Nervous players sent their caddies on in front of them at blind holes, so that they might be warned in time of Wallace's presence ahead, and not have him happening to them all of a sudden. And even the pro was not unaffected. Brought up in Scotland in an atmosphere of tartan kilts, he nevertheless winced, and a startled "hoots" was forced from his lips when Wallace Chesney suddenly appeared in the valley as he was about to drive from the 5th tee. But in about a week conditions were back to normalcy. Within 10 days the +4s became a familiar feature of the landscape, and were accepted as such without comment. They were pointed out to strangers together with the waterfall, the lover's leap, and the view from the 8th green, as things you ought not to miss when visiting the course. But apart from that, one might almost say they were ignored. And meanwhile Wallace Chesney continued day by day to make the most extraordinary progress in his play. As I said before, and I think you will agree with me, when I have told you what happened subsequently, it was probably a case of auto-hypnosis. There is no other sphere in which a belief in oneself has such immediate effects as it has in golf, and Wallace, having acquired self-confidence, went on from strength to strength. In under a week he had ploughed his way through the unfortunate incidents, of which class Peter Willard was the best example, and was challenging the fellows who kept 3 shots in 5 somewhere on the fairway. A month later he was holding his own with 10 handicap men, and by the middle of the summer he was so far advanced that his name occasionally cropped up in speculative talks on the subject of the July medal. One might have been excused for supposing that as far as Wallace Chesney was concerned, all was for the best in the best of all possible worlds, and yet— The first inkling I received that anything was wrong came through a chance meeting with Raymond Gandel, who happened to pass my gate on his way back from the links, just as I drove up in my taxi. For I had been away from home for many weeks on a protracted business tour. I welcomed Gandel's advent and invited him in to smoke a pipe and put me abreast of local gossip. He came readily enough, and seemed indeed to have something on his mind, and to be glad of the opportunity of revealing it to a sympathetic auditor. "And how," I asked him, when we were comfortably settled, "did your game this afternoon come out?" "Oh, he beat me," said Gandal, and it seemed to me that there was a note of bitterness in his voice. "Then he, whoever he was, must have been an extremely competent performer," I replied courteously, for Gandal was one of the finest players in the club. "Unless, of course, you were giving him some impossible handicap." "No, we played level." "Indeed? Who was your opponent?" "Chesney." "Wallace Chesney, and he beat you, playing level? This is the most amazing thing I have ever heard. He's improved out of all knowledge." "He must have done. Do you think he would ever beat you again?" "No, because he won't have the chance." "You surely do not mean that you will not play him because you are afraid of being beaten?" "It isn't being beaten I mind." And if I omit to report the remainder of his speech, it is not merely because it contained expressions with which I am reluctant to sully my lips, but because, omitting these expletives, what he said was almost word for word what you were saying to me just now about Nathaniel Frisbee. It was, it seemed, Wallace Chesney's manner, his arrogance, his attitude of belonging to some superior order of being, that had so wounded Raymond Gandal. Wallace Chesney had, it appeared, criticised Gandal's mashie play in no friendly spirit, had hung up the game on the 14th tee in order to show him how to place his feet, and on the way back to the clubhouse had said that the beauty of golf was that the best player could enjoy a round even with a dud, because, though there might be no interest in the match, he could always amuse himself by playing for his medal score. I was profoundly shaken. "Wallace Chesney!" I exclaimed. "Was it really Wallace Chesney who behaved in the manner you describe? Unless he's got a twin brother of the same name it was. Wallace Chesney a victim to swelled head! I can hardly credit it." "Well, you needn't take my word for it unless you want to. Ask anybody. It isn't often he can get anyone to play with him now." "You horrify me." Raymond Gandal smoked a while in brooding silence. "You've heard about his engagement?" he said at length. "I have heard nothing. Nothing. What about his engagement?" "Charlotte Dix has broken it off." "No!" "Yes. Couldn't stand him any longer. I got rid of Gandal as soon as I could. I made my way as quickly as possible to the house where Charlotte lived with her aunt. I was determined to sift this matter to the bottom, and to do all that lay in my power to heal the breach between two young people for whom I had a great affection. "I have just heard the news," I said, when the aunt had retired to some secret lair, as aunts do, and Charlotte and I were alone. "What news?" said Charlotte dully. I thought she looked pale and ill, and she had certainly grown thinner. "This dreadful news about your engagement to Wallace Chesney. Tell me, why did you do this thing? Is there no hope of a reconciliation?" "Not unless Wally becomes his old self again." "But I had always regarded you two as ideally suited to one another." "Wally has changed completely in the last few weeks. Haven't you heard?" "Only sketchily from Raymond Gandal." "I refuse," said Charlotte proudly, all the woman in her leaping to her eyes, "to marry a man who treats me as if I were a cronin at the present rate of exchange, merely because I slice an occasional tea-shot. The afternoon I broke off the engagement—" Her voice shook, and I could see her indifference was but a mask. "The afternoon I broke off the engagement, he told me I ought to use an iron off the tee instead of a driver." And the stricken girl burst into an uncontrollable fit of sobbing. and realizing that, if matters had gone so far as that, there was little I could do, I pressed her hand silently and left her. But though it seemed hopeless, I decided to persevere. I turned my steps towards Wallace Chesney's bungalow, resolved to make one appeal to the man's better feelings. He was in his sitting-room when I arrived, polishing a putter, and it seemed significant to me, even in that tense moment, that the putter was quite an ordinary one, such as any capable player might use. In the brave old happy days of his dudhood, the only putters you ever found in the society of Wallace Chesney were patent, self-adjusting things that looked like croquet mallets that had taken the wrong turning in childhood. "Well, Wallace, my boy," I said. "Hello," said Wallace Chesney, "so you're back." We fell into conversation, and I had not been in the room 2 minutes before I realized that what I had been told about the change in him was nothing more than the truth. The man's bearing and his every remark were insufferably bumptious. He spoke of his prospects in the July medal competition as if the issue were already settled. He scoffed at his rivals. I had some little difficulty in bringing the talk round to the matter which I had come to discuss. "My boy," I said at length, "I have just heard the sad news." "What sad news?" "I have been talking to Charlotte." "Oh, that," said Wallace Chesney. "She was telling me—" "Perhaps it's all for the best." "All for the best? What do you mean?" "Well," said Wallace, "one doesn't wish, of course, to say anything ungallant, but after all, poor Charlotte's handicap is 14, and wouldn't appear to have much chance of getting any lower. I mean, there's such a thing as a fellow throwing himself away." Was I revolted at these callous words? For a moment, yes. Then it struck me that, though he had uttered them with a light laugh, that laugh had had in it more than a touch of bravado. I looked at him keenly. There was a bored, discontented expression in his eyes, a line of pain about his mouth. "My boy," I said gravely, "you are not happy." For an instant I think he would have denied the imputation, but my visit had coincided with one of those twilight moods in which a man requires above all else sympathy. He uttered a weary sigh. "I'm fed up," he admitted. "It's a funny thing. When I was a dud, I used to think how perfect it must be to be Scratch. I used to watch the cracks buzzing around the course and envy them. It's all a fraud. The only time when you enjoy golf is when an occasional decent shot is enough to make you happy for the day. I'm +2, and I'm bored to death. I'm too good. And what's the result? Everybody's jealous of me, everybody's got it in for me, nobody loves me." His voice rose in a note of anguish, and at the sound his terrier, which had been sleeping on the rug, crept forward and licked his hand. "The dog loves you?" I said gently, for I was touched. "Yes, but I don't love the dog," said Wallace Chesney. "Now come, Wallace," I said. "Be reasonable, my boy. It is only your unfortunate manner on the links which has made you perhaps a little unpopular at the moment. Why not pull yourself up? Why ruin your whole life with this arrogance? All that you need is a little tact, a little forbearance. Charlotte, I am sure, is just as fond of you as ever, but you have wounded her pride. Why must you be unkind about her tee-shots?" Wallace Chesney shook his head despondently. "I can't help it," he said. "It exasperates me to see anyone fooling, and I have to say so." "Then there is nothing to be done," I said sadly. "All the medal competitions at our club are, as you know, important events, but, as you are also aware, none of them is looked forward to so keenly or contested so hotly as the one in July. At the beginning of the year of which I am speaking, Raymond Gandel had been considered the probable winner of the fixture, but as the season progressed, and Wallace Chesney's skill developed to such a remarkable extent, Most of us were reluctantly inclined to put our money on the latter. Reluctantly, because Wallace's unpopularity was now so general that thought of his winning was distasteful to all. It grieved me to see how cold his fellow members were towards him. He drove off from the first tee without a preliminary hand-clap, and though the drive was of admirable quality and nearly carried the green, there was not a single cheer. I noticed Charlotte Dix among the spectators. The poor girl was looking sad and wan. In the draw for partners, Wallace had Peter Willard allotted to him, and he muttered to me in a quite audible voice that it was as bad as handicapping him half a dozen strokes to make him play with such a hopeless performer. I do not think Peter heard, but it would not have made much difference to him if he had, for I doubt if anything could have had much effect for the worse on his game. Peter Willard always entered for the medal competition, because he said that competition play was good for the nerves. On this occasion he topped his ball badly, and Wallace lit his pipe with the exaggeratedly patient air of an irritated man. When Peter topped his second also, Wallace was moved to speech. "For goodness' sake," he snapped, "what's the good of playing at all if you insist on lifting your head? Keep it down, man, keep it down. You don't need to watch to see where the ball is going. It isn't likely to go as far as all that. Make up your mind to count 3 before you look up." "Thanks," said Peter meekly. There was no pride in Peter to be wounded. He knew the sort of player he was. The couples were now moving off with smooth rapidity, and the course was dotted with the figures of players and their accompanying spectators. A fair proportion of these latter had decided to follow the fortunes of Raymond Gandel, but by far the larger number were sticking to Wallace, who, right from the start, showed that Gandel or anyone else would have to return a very fine card to beat him. He was out in 41, 2 above bogey, and with the assistance of a superb second, which landed the ball within a foot of the pin, got a 3 on the 10th, where a 4 is considered good. I mention this to show that by the time he arrived at the short lake hole, Wallace Chesney was at the top of his form. Not even the fact that he had been obliged to let the next couple through owing to Peter Willard losing his ball had been enough to upset him. The course has been rearranged since, but at that time the lake hole, which is now the 2nd, was the 11th, and was generally looked on as the crucial hole in a medal round. Wallace no doubt realized this, but the knowledge did not seem to affect him. He lit his pipe with the utmost coolness, and having replaced the matchbox in his hip pocket, stood smoking nonchalantly, as he waited for the couple in front to get off the green. They holed out eventually, and Wallace walked to the tee. As he did so, he was startled to receive a resounding smack. "Sorry," said Peter Willard apologetically. "Hope I didn't hurt you. A wasp," and he pointed to the corpse, which was lying in a used-up attitude on the ground. "Afraid it would sting you," said Peter. "Oh, thanks," said Wallace. He spoke a little stiffly, for Peter Willard had a large, hard, flat hand, the impact of which had shaken him up considerably. Also there had been laughter in the crowd. He was fuming as he bent to address his ball, and his annoyance became acute when, just as he reached the top of his swing, Peter Willard suddenly spoke. "Just a second, old man," said Peter. Wallace spun round, outraged. "What is it? I do wish you would wait till I've made my shot." "Just as you like," said Peter, humbly. There is no greater crime that a man can commit on the links than to speak to a fellow when he's making his stroke. Of course," acquiesced Peter, crushed. Wallace turned to his ball once more. He was vaguely conscious of a discomfort to which he could not at the moment give a name. At first he thought that he was having a spasm of lumbago, and this surprised him, for he had never in his life been subject to even a suspicion of that malady. A moment later he realized that this diagnosis had been wrong. "Good heavens!" he cried, leaping nimbly some 2 feet into the air. "I'm on fire!" "Yes," said Peter, delighted at his ready grasp of the situation. "That's what I wanted to mention just now." Wallace slapped vigorously at the seat of his +4s. "It must have been when I killed that wasp," said Peter, beginning to see clearly into the matter. "You had a matchbox in your pocket." Wallace was in no mood to stop and discuss first causes. He was springing up and down on his pyre, beating at the flames. "Do you know what I should do if I were you?" said Peter Willard. "I should jump into the lake." One of the cardinal rules of golf is that a player shall accept no advice from anyone but his own caddy. But the warmth about his lower limbs had now become so generous that Wallace was prepared to stretch a point. He took 3 rapid strides and entered the water with a splash. The lake, though muddy, is not deep, and presently Wallace was to be observed standing up to his waist some few feet from the shore. "That ought to have put it out," said Peter Willard. "It was a bit of luck that it happened at this hole." He stretched out a hand to the bather. "Catch hold, old man, and I'll pull you out." "No," said Wallace Chesney. "Why not?" "Never mind," said Wallace austerely. He bent as near to Peter as he was able. "Send a caddy up to the clubhouse to fetch my grey flannel trousers from my locker," he whispered tensely. "Oh, said Peter. It was some little time before Wallace, encircled by a group of male spectators, was enabled to change his costume, and during the interval he continued to stand waist-deep in the water, to the chagrin of various couples who came to the tee in the course of their round, and complained with not a little bitterness that his presence there added a mental hazard to an already difficult hole. Eventually, however, he found himself back ashore, his ball before him, his mashie in his hand. "Carry on," said Peter Willard as the couple in front left the green. "All clear now." Wallace Chesney addressed his ball, and even as he did so he was suddenly aware that an odd psychological change had taken place in himself. He was aware of a strange weakness. The charred remains of the +4s were lying under an adjacent bush, and clad in the old grey flannels of his early golfing days, Wallace felt diffident, feeble, uncertain of himself. It was as though virtue had gone out of him, as if some indispensable adjunct to good play had been removed. His corrugated trouser leg caught his eye as he waggled, and all at once he became acutely alive to the fact that many eyes were watching him. The audience seemed to press on him like a blanket. He felt as he had been wont to feel in the old days when he had had to drive off the first tee in front of a terrace full of scoffing critics. The next moment his ball had bounded weakly over the intervening patch of turf and was in the water. "Hard luck," said Peter Willard, ever a generous foe, and the words seemed to touch some almost atrophied chord in Wallace's breast. A sudden love for his species flooded over him. Dashed decent of Peter, he thought, to sympathize. Peter was a good chap. So were the spectators good chaps. So was everybody, even his caddy. Peter Willard, as if resolved to make his sympathy practical, also rolled his ball into the lake. "Hard luck," said Wallace Chesney, and started as he said it, for many weeks had passed since he had commiserated with an opponent. He felt a changed man, a better, sweeter, kindlier man. It was as if a curse had fallen from him. He teed up another ball and swung. "Hard luck," said Peter. "Hard luck," said Wallace a moment later. "Hard luck," said Peter a moment after that. Wallace Chesney stood on the tee watching the spot in the water where his third ball had fallen. The crowd was now openly amused, and as he listened to their happy laughter it was borne in upon Wallace that he too was amused and happy. A weird, almost effervescent exhilaration filled him. He turned and beamed upon the spectators. He waved his mashie cheerfully at them. This, he felt, was something like golf. This was golf as it should be, not the dull mechanical thing which had bored him during all these past weeks of his perfection, but a gay, rollicking adventure. That was the soul of golf, the thing that made it the wonderful pursuit it was, that speculativeness, that not knowing where the dickens your ball was going when you hit it, that eternal hoping for the best, that never-failing chanciness. It is better to struggle hopefully than to arrive, and at last this great truth had come home to Wallace Chesney. He realized now why pros were all grave, silent men who seemed to struggle manfully against some secret sorrow. It was because they were too darned good. Golf had no surprises for them, no gallant spirit of adventure. "I'm going to get a ball over if I stay here all night," cried Wallace Chesney gaily, and the crowd echoed his mirth. On the face of Charlotte Dix was the look of a mother whose prodigal son has rolled into the old home once more. She caught Wallace's eyes and gesticulated to him blithely. "The cripple says he'll give you a stroke a hole, Wally," she shouted. "I'm ready for him," bellowed Wallace. "Hard luck," said Peter Willard. Under their bush the +4s, charred and dripping, lurked unnoticed, but Wallace Chesney saw them. They caught his eye as he sliced his 11th into the marshes on the right. It seemed to him that they looked sullen, disappointed, baffled. Wallace Chesney was himself.
Chapter 20 of Wodehouse in the Strand. Short Story Collection. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Wodehouse in the Strand. Short Story Collection by Pelham Granville Wodehouse. Chapter 20. The Metropolitan Touch. Nobody's more alive than I am to the fact that young Bingo Little is in many respects a sound old egg, but I must say there are things about him that could be improved. The man's too expansive altogether. When it comes to letting the world in on the secrets of his heart, he has about as much shrinking reticence as a steam calliope. Well, for instance, here's the telegram I got from him one evening in November. "I say, Bertie, old man, I'm in love at last. She's the most wonderful girl, Bertie, old man. This is the real thing at last, Bertie. Come here at once and bring Jeeves. Oh, I say, you know that tobacco shop in Bond Street on the left side as you go up? Will you get me 100 of their special cigarettes and send them to me here? I've run out. I know when you see her you'll think she is the most wonderful girl. And mind you bring Jeeves. Don't forget the cigarettes. Bingo." It had been handed in at Twing Post Office. In other words, he'd submitted that frightful rot to the goggling eye of a village postmistress, who's probably the mainspring of local gossip, and would have the place ringing with the news before nightfall. He couldn't have given himself away more completely if he'd hired the town crier. When I was a kid I used to read stories about knights and Vikings and that species of chappie who would get up without blush in the middle of a crowded banquet and loose off a song about how perfectly priceless they thought their best girl. I've often felt that those days would have suited young Bingo down to the ground. Jeeves had brought the thing in with the evening drink, and I slung it over to him. "It's about due, of course," I said. "Young Bingo hasn't been in love for at least a couple of months. I wonder who it is this time." "Miss Mary Burgess, sir," said Jeeves. "The niece of the Reverend Mr. Heppenstall. She's staying at Twing Vicarage." Great Scott! I knew that Jeeves knew practically everything in the world, but this sounded like second sight. "How do you know that?" "When we were visiting Twing Hall in the summer, sir, I formed a somewhat close friendship with Mr. Heppenstall's butler. He is good enough to keep me abreast of the local news from time to time. From this account, sir, the young lady appears to be a very estimable young lady, of a somewhat serious nature, I understand. Mr. Little is very épris, sir. Brookfield, my correspondent, writes that last week he observed him in the moonlight at an advanced hour gazing up at his window. Whose window? Brookfield's? Yes, sir, presumably under the impression that it was the young lady's. But what the deuce is he doing at Twing at all? Mr. Little was compelled to resume his old position as tutor to Lord Wickhammersley's son at Twing Hall, sir, owing to having been unsuccessful in some speculations at Hurst Park at the end of October. Good Lord, Jeeves, is there anything you don't know? I couldn't say, sir. I picked up the telegram. I suppose he wants us to go down and help him out a bit. That would appear to be his motive in dispatching the message, sir. Well, what shall we do? Go? I would advocate it, sir. If I may say so, I think that Mr. Little should be encouraged in this particular matter. You think he's picked a winner this time? I hear nothing but excellent reports of the young lady, sir. I think it is beyond question that she would be an admirable influence for Mr. Little, should the affair come to a happy conclusion. Such a union would also, I fancy, go far to restore Mr. Little to the good graces of his uncle, the young lady being well connected and possessing private means. In short, sir, I think that if there's anything that we can do, we should do it. Well, with you behind him, I said, I don't see how he can fail to click. Oh, very good, sir, said Jeeves. The tribute is much appreciated. Bingo met us at Twing Station next day, and insisted on my sending Jeeves on in the car with the bags, while he and I walked. He started in about the female the moment we'd begun to hoof it. She's very wonderful, Bertie. She's not one of those flippant, shallow-minded modern girls. She's sweetly grave and beautifully earnest. She reminds me of... what's the name I want? Mary Lloyd? St. Cecilia, said young Bingo, eyeing me with a good deal of loathing. She reminds me of St. Cecilia. She makes me yearn to be a better, nobler, deeper, broader man. What beats me, I said, following up a train of thought, is what principle you pick them on. The girls you fall in love with, I mean. I mean to say, what's your system? As far as I can see, no two of them are alike. First it was Mabel the waitress, then Honoria Glossop, then that fearful blister Charlotte Corday Rowbottom. I own that Bingo had the decency to shudder. Thinking of Charlotte always made me shudder too. You don't seriously mean, Bertie, that you're intending to compare the feeling I have for Mary Burgess, the holy devotion, the spiritual— Oh, all right, let it go, I said. I say, old lad, aren't we going rather a long way round? Considering that we were supposed to be headed for Twing Hall, it seemed to me that we were making a longish job of it. The hall is about 2 miles from the station by the main road, and we'd cut off down a lane, gone across country for a bit, climbed a stile or two, and were now working our way across a field that ended in another lane. She sometimes takes her little brother for a walk round this way, explained Bingo. I thought we would meet her and bow, and you could see her, you know, and then we'd walk on. Of course, I said. That's enough excitement for anyone, and undoubtedly a corking reward for tramping 3 miles out of one's way over ploughed fields with tight boots. But don't we do anything else? Don't we tack on to the girl and buzz along with her? Good Lord, said Bingo, honestly amazed. You don't suppose I've got nerve enough for that, do you? I just look at her from afar and all that sort of thing. Quick, here she comes. Oh, no, I'm wrong. It was like that song of Harry Lauder's, where he's waiting for the girl and says, This is her. No, it's a rabbit. Young Bingo made me stand there in the teeth of a nor'east half-gale for 10 minutes, keeping me on my toes with a series of false alarms, and I was just thinking of suggesting that we should lay off and give the rest of the proceedings a miss, when round the corner there came a fox-terrier, and Bingo quivered like an aspen. Then there hove in sight a small boy, and he shook like a jelly. Finally, like a star whose entrance has been worked up by the personnel of the ensemble, a girl appeared, and his emotion was painful to witness. His face got so red that, what with his white collar and the fact that the wind had turned his nose blue, he looked more like a French flag than anything else. He sagged from the waist upwards, as if he'd been filleted. He was just raising his fingers limply to his cap, when he suddenly saw that the girl wasn't alone. The chappie in clerical costume was also among those present, and the sight of him didn't seem to do Bingo a bit of good. His face got redder, and his nose bluer, and it wasn't till they'd nearly passed that he managed to get hold of his cap. The girl bowed. The curate said, "Ah, Little, rough weather." The dog barked, and then they toddled on, and the entertainment was over. The curate was a new factor in the situation to me. I reported his movements to Jeeves when I got to the hall. Of course, Jeeves knew all about it already. "That is the Reverend Mr. Wingham, Mr. Heppenstall's new curate, sir. I gather from Brookfield that he is Mr. Little's rival, and that at the moment the young lady appears to favour him. Mr. Wingham has the advantage of being on the premises. He and the young lady played duets after dinner, which acts as a bond. Mr. Little on these occasions, I understand, prowls about in the road, chafing visibly. That seems to be all the poor fish is able to do. Dash it! He could chafe all right, but there he stops. He's lost his pep. He's got no dash. Why, when we met her just now, he hadn't even the common manly courage to say, 'Good evening.' I gather that Mr. Little's affection is not unmingled with awe, sir." "Well, how are we to help a man when he's such a rabbit as that? Have you anything to suggest? I shall be seeing him after dinner, and he's sure to ask first thing what you advise." "In my opinion, sir, the most judicious course for Mr. Little to pursue would be to concentrate on the young gentleman." "The small brother? How do you mean?" "Make a friend of him, sir. Take him for walks and so forth." "It doesn't sound one of your red-hottest ideas. I must say I expected something fruitier than that." "It would be a beginning, sir, and might lead to better things." "Well, I'll tell him. I like the look of her, Jeeves. A thoroughly estimable young lady, sir." I slipped Bingo the tip from the stable that night, and was glad to observe that it seemed to cheer him up. "Jeeves is always right," he said. "I ought to have thought of it myself. I'll start in to-morrow." It was amazing how the chappie bucked up. Long before I left for town it had become a mere commonplace for him to speak to the girl. I mean, he didn't simply look stuffed when they met. The brother was forming a bond that was a dashed sight stronger than the curate's duets. She and Bingo used to take him for walks together. I asked Bingo what they talked about on these occasions, and he said Wilfrid's future. The girl hoped that Wilfrid would one day become a curate, but Bingo said no, there was something about curates he didn't quite like. The day we left, Bingo came to see us off with Wilfrid frisking about it like an old college chum. The last I saw of them, Bingo was standing him chocolates out of the slot machine, a scene of peace and cheery goodwill. Dashed promising, I thought, which made it all the more of a jar about a fortnight later when his telegram arrived, as follows: "Bertie, old man, I say, Bertie, could you possibly come down here at once? Everything gone wrong, hang it all. Dash it, Bertie, you simply must come. I am in a state of absolute despair and heartbroken. Would you mind sending another 100 of those cigarettes? And bring Jeeves when you come, Bertie. You simply must come, Bertie. I rely on you. Don't forget to bring Jeeves. Bingo." For a chap who's perpetually hard up, I must say that young Bingo is the most wasteful telegraphist I ever struck. He's got no notion of condensing. The silly ass simply pours out his wounded soul at twopence a word, or whatever it is, without a thought. "How about it, Jeeves?" I said. "Getting a bit fed. I can't go chucking all my engagements every second week in order to biff down to Twing and rally round young Bingo. Send him a wire telling him to end it all in the village pond." "If you could spare me for the night, sir, I should be glad to run down and investigate." "Oh, dash it. Well, I suppose there's nothing else to be done. After all, you're the fellow he wants. All right, carry on." Jeeves got back late the next day, "Well?" I said. Jeeves appeared perturbed. He allowed his left eyebrow to flicker upwards in a concerned sort of manner. "I have done what I could, sir," he said, "but I fear Mr. Little's chances do not appear bright. Since our last visit, sir, there has been a decidedly sinister and disquieting development." "Oh? What's that?" "You may remember Mr. Steggles, sir, the young gentleman who was studying for an examination with Mr. Heppenstall at the vicarage." Of course I remembered Steggles. You'll place him if you throw your mind back. Recollect the rat-faced chappie of sporting tastes who made the book on the sermon handicap and then made another on the choir boy of sports. That's the fellow. A blighter of infinite guile and up to every shady scheme on the list. Though, thanks to Jeeves, we'd let him in pretty badly on the girls' egg and spoon race, and collected a parcel off him in spite of his villainies. "What's Steggles got to do with it?" I asked. "I gather from Brookfield, sir, who chanced to overhear a conversation, that Mr. Steggles is interesting himself in the affair." "Good Lord! What, making a book on it?" "I understand that he is accepting wagers from those in his immediate circle, sir, against Mr. Little, whose chances he does not seem to fancy." "I don't like that, Jeeves." "No, sir. It is sinister. From what I know of Steggles, there will be dirty work." "It has already occurred, sir." "Already?" "Yes, sir. It seems that in pursuance of the policy which he'd been good enough to allow me to suggest to him, Mr. Little escorted Master Burgess to the church bazaar, and there met Mr. Steggles, who was in the company of young Master Heppenstall, the Reverend Mr. Heppenstall's second son, who is home from Rugby just now, having recently recovered from an attack of mumps. The encounter took place in the refreshment room, where Mr. Steggles was at that moment entertaining Master Heppenstall. To cut a long story short, sir, the two gentlemen became extremely interested in the hearty matter in which the lads were fortifying themselves, and Mr. Steggles offered to back his nominee in a weight-for-age eating contest against Master Burgess for £1 a side. Mr. Little admitted to me that he was conscious of a certain hesitation as to what the upshot might be, should Miss Burgess get to hear of the matter, but his sporting blood was too much for him, and he agreed to the contest. This was duly carried out, both lads exhibiting the utmost willingness and enthusiasm, and eventually Master Burgess justified Mr. Little's confidence by winning, but only after a bitter struggle. Next day both contestants were in considerable pain. Inquiries were made, and confessions extorted, and Mr. Little, I learned from Brookfield, who happened to be near the door of the drawing-room at the moment, had an extremely unpleasant interview with the young lady, which ended in her desiring him never to speak to her again. There's no getting away from the fact that if ever a man required watching, it's Steggles. Machiavelli could have taken his correspondence course. "It was a put-up job, Jeeves," I said. "I mean, Steggles worked the whole thing on purpose. It's his old nobbling game." "There would seem to be no doubt about that, sir." "Well, he seems to have dished poor old Bingo all right." "That is the prevalent opinion, sir. Brookfield tells me that down in the village at the Cow and Horses 7 to 1 is being freely offered Mr. Wingham and finding no takers." "Good Lord, are they betting about it down in the village too?" "Yes, sir, and in adjoining hamlets also. The affair has caused widespread interest. I'm told that there is a certain sporting reaction in even so distant a spot as Lower Bingley." "Well, I don't see what there is to do. If Bingo's such a chump, one is fighting a losing battle, I hear, sir. But I did venture to indicate to Mr. Little a course of action which might prove of advantage. I recommended him to busy himself with good works." "Good works?" "About the village, sir. Reading to the bedridden, chatting with the sick, that sort of thing, sir. We can but trust that good results will ensue." "Yes, I suppose so," I said doubtfully. But by gosh, if I was a sick man, I'd hate to have a loony like young Bingo coming and gibbering at my bedside. There is that aspect of the matter, sir, said Jeeves. I didn't hear a word from Bingo for a couple of weeks, and I took it, after a while, that he'd found the going too hard and had chucked in the towel. And then one night, not long before Christmas, I came back to the flat pretty latish, having been out dancing at the embassy. I was fairly tired, having swung a practically non-stop shoe from shortly after dinner till 2 a.m, and bed seemed to be indicated. Judge of my chagrin and all that sort of thing, therefore, when, tottering to my room and switching on the light, I observed the foul features of young Bingo all over the pillow. The blighter had appeared from nowhere and was in my bed, sleeping like an infant, with a sort of happy, dreamy smile on his map. Bit thick, I mean to say. We Worcesters are all for the good old medieval hospital and that, but when it comes to finding chappies collaring your bed, the thing becomes a trifle too mouldy. I hove a shoe, and Bingo sat up, gurgling. "Smatter, smatter," said young Bingo. "What the deuce are you doing in my bed?" I said. "Oh, hello, Bertie. So there you are." "Yes, here I am. What are you doing in my bed?" "I came up to town for the night on business." "Yes, but what are you doing in my bed?" "Dash it all, Bertie," said young Bingo querulously, "don't keep harping on your beastly bed. There's another made up in the spare room. I saw Jeeves make it with my own eyes. I believe he meant it for me, but I knew what a perfect host you were, so I just turned in. Here." "I say, Bertie, old man," said Bingo, apparently fed up with the discussion about sleeping quarters, "I see daylight." "Well, it's getting on for 3 in the morning." "I was speaking figuratively, you ass. I meant that hope has begun to dawn. About Mary Burgess, you know. Sit down and I'll tell you all about it." "I won't. I'm going to sleep." "To begin with," said young Bingo, settling himself comfortably against the pillows and helping himself to a cigarette from my special private box, "I must once again pay a marked tribute to good old Jeeves, modern Solomon. I was badly up against it when I came to him for advice, but he rolled up with a tip which has put me, I use the term advisedly and in a conservative spirit, on velvet. He may have told you that he recommended me to win back the lost ground by busying myself with good works. Bertie, old man," said young Bingo earnestly, "for the last 2 weeks I've been comforting the sick to such an extent that if I had a brother, and you brought him to me on a sick bed at this moment, by Jove, old man, I'd heave a brick at him. However, though it took it out of me, like the deuce, the scheme worked splendidly. She softened visibly before I'd been at it a week, started to bow again when we met in the street and so forth. About a couple of days ago she distinctly smiled, in a sort of faint, saint-like kind of way, you know, when I ran into her outside the vicarage, and yesterday— I say, you remember that curate chap, Wingham, fellow with a long nose and a sort of goofy expression?" "Of course I remember him. Your rival." "Rival?" Bingo raised his eyebrows. "Oh, well, I suppose you could have called him that at one time, though it sounds a little far-fetched." "Does it?" I said, stung by the sickening complacency of the chump's manner. "Well, let me tell you that the last I heard was that at the Cow and Horses in Twing Village, and all over the place as far as Lower Bingley, they were offering 7 to 1 on the curate, and finding no takers." Bingo started violently, and sprayed cigarette ash all over my bed. "Betting?" he gargled. "Betting? You don't mean that they're betting on this holy, sacred— Oh, I say, dash it all, haven't people any sense of decency and reverence? Is nothing safe from their beastly, sordid graspingness? I wonder," said young Bingo thoughtfully, "if there's a chance by getting any of that 7 to 1 money. 7 to 1? What a price! Who's offering it, do you know?" "Oh, well, I suppose it wouldn't do, no. I suppose it wouldn't be quite the thing." "You seem dashed confident," I said. "I'd always thought that Wingham—" "Oh, I'm not worried about him," said Bingo. "I was just going to tell you Wingham's got the mumps and won't be out and about for weeks, and jolly as that is in itself, it's not all. You see, he was producing the village school Christmas entertainment, and now I've taken over the job. I went to see old Heppenstall last night and clinched the contract. Well, you see what that means. It means that I shall be absolutely the centre of village life and thought for 3 solid weeks, with a terrific triumph to wind up with. Everybody's looking up to me and fawning on me, don't you see, and all that. It's bound to have a powerful effect on Mary's mind. It will show her that I'm capable of serious effort, that there is a solid foundation of worth in me, that, mere butterfly as she may once have thought me, I am in reality— oh, all right, let it go. It's a big thing, you know, this Christmas entertainment. Old Heppenstall very much wrapped up in it, nibs from all over the countryside rolling up, the squire present with family. A big chance for me, Bertie, my boy, and I mean to make the most of it. Of course, I'm handicapped a bit by not having been on the thing from the start. Will you credit it that uninspired donut of a curate wanted to give the public some rotten little fairy play out of a book for children published about 50 years ago, without one good laugh, or the semblance of a gag in it? Too late to alter the thing entirely, but at least I can jazz it up. I'm going to write them in something zippy to brighten the thing up a bit. You can't write. Well, when I say write, I mean pinch. That's why I popped into town. I've been to see that review, Cuddle Up, at the Palladium, tonight. Full of good stuff, of course. It's rather hard to get anything in the nature of a big spectacular effect in the Twing Village Hall, with no scenery to speak of, and a chorus of practically imbecile kids of ages ranging from 9 to 14, but I think I see my way. Have you seen Cuddle Up? Yes, twice. Well, there's some good stuff in the first act, and I can practically lift all the numbers. Then there's that show at the Palace. I can see the matinee of that tomorrow before I leave. There's sure to be some decent bits in that. Don't you worry about my not being able to write a bit. Leave it, my dear old chap, said young Bingo, snuggling down cosily. You mustn't keep me up talking all night. It's all right for you fellows who've nothing to do, but I'm a busy man. Good night, old thing. Close the door quietly after you and switch out the light. Breakfast about 10 tomorrow, I suppose. What? Righto. Good night. For the next 3 weeks I didn't see Bingo. He became a sort of voice heard off, developing a habit of ringing me up on long distance and consulting me on various points arising at rehearsal, until the day when he got me out of bed at 8 in the morning to ask whether I thought Merry Christmas was a good title. I told him then that this nuisance must now cease, and after that he cheesed it, and practically passed out of my life, till one afternoon when I got back to the flat to dress for dinner, and found Jeeves inspecting a whacking big poster sort of thing which he'd draped over the back of an armchair. "Good Lord, Jeeves," I said. I was feeling rather weak that day, and the thing shook me. "What on earth's that?" "Mr. Little sent it to me, sir, and desired me to bring it to your notice." "Well, you've certainly done it." I took another look at the object. There was no doubt about it. It caught the eye. It was about 7 feet long, and most of the lettering in about as bright a red ink as I ever struck. "What do you make of it, Jeeves?" I said. "I confess I am a little doubtful, sir. I think Mr. Little would have done better to follow my advice, and confine himself to good works about the village." "You think the thing would be a frost?" "I could not hazard a conjecture, sir, but my experience has been that, whilst it pleases the London public, is not always so acceptable to the rural mind. The metropolitan touch sometimes proves a trifle too exotic for the provinces. I suppose I ought to go down and see the dashed thing." "I think Mr. Little would be wounded were you not present, sir." The village hall at Twing is a smallish building smelling of apples. It was full when I turned up on the evening of the 23rd, for I had purposely timed myself to arrive not long before the kick-off. I had had experience of 1 or 2 of these binges, and didn't want to run any risk of coming early and finding myself shoved into a seat in one of the front rows, where I wouldn't be able to execute a quiet sneak into the open air halfway through the proceedings, if the occasion seemed to demand it. I secured a nice strategic position near the door at the back of the hall. From where I stood I had a good view of the audience. As always on these occasions, the first few rows were occupied by the nibs, consisting of the squire, a fairly mauve old sportsman with white whiskers, his family, a platoon of local parsons, and perhaps a couple of dozen prominent pew-holders. Then came a dense squash of what you might call the lower middle classes, and at the back, where I was, we came down with a jerk in the social scale, this end of the hall being given up almost entirely to a collection of frankly tough eggs, who had rolled up, not so much for any love of the drama as because there was a free tea after the show. Take it for all in all, a representative gathering of twing life and thought. The nibs were whispering in a pleased manner to each other, the lower middle classes were sitting up very straight as if they'd been bleached, and the tough eggs whiled away the time by cracking nuts and exchanging low rustic wheezes. The girl, Mary Burgess, was at the piano, playing a waltz. Beside her stood the curate, Wingham, apparently recovered. The temperature, I should think, was about 127. Somebody jabbed me heartily in the lower ribs, and I perceived the man, Steggles. "Hello," he said. "I didn't know you were coming down." I didn't like the chap, but we Worcesters can wear the mask. I beamed a bit. "Oh, yes," I said. "Bingo wanted me to roll up and see his show." "I hear he's giving us something pretty ambitious," said the man Steggles. "The effects, and all that sort of thing." "I believe so." "Of course, means a lot to him, doesn't it? He's told you about the girl, of course?" "Yes, and I hear you're laying several to one against him," I said, eyeing the blighter a trifle austerely. He didn't even quiver. "Oh, just a little flutter to relieve the more monotony of country life," he said. "You got the facts a bit wrong. It's down in the village that they're laying 7 to 1. You can do better than that if you feel speculative mood. How about a 10 or 100 to 8? "Good Lord, are you giving that?" "Yes, somehow," said Steggles, meditatively. "I'm sort of feeling a kind of premonition that something's going to go wrong tonight. You know what Little is, bugler if ever there was one. Something tells me this show is going to be a frost. And if it is, of course, I should prejudice the girl against him pretty badly. His standing always was rather shaky." "They're going to try and smash up the show?" I said sternly. "Me?" said Steggles. "Why, what could I do? Half a minute. I wanted to speak to a man." He buzzed off, leaving me distinctly disturbed. I could see from the fellow's eye that he was meditating some cussery rough stuff, and I thought Bingo ought to be warned. But there wasn't time, and I couldn't get at him. Almost immediately after Steggles had left, the curtain went up. Except as a prompter, Bingo wasn't much in evidence in the early part of the performance. The thing at the outset was merely one of those weird dramas which you dig out of books published around Christmas time and entitled 12 Little Plays for the Tots, or something like that. The kids drooled on in the usual manner, the booming voice of Bingo ringing out from time to time behind the scenes when the fatheads forgot their lines, and the audience was settling down into the sort of torpor usual on these occasions, when the first of Bingo's interpolated bits occurred. It was the number which What's-her-name sings in that review at the Palace. You'd recognise the tune if I hummed it, but I can never get hold of the dashed thing. It always got 3 encores at the Palace, and it went well now, even with a squeaky-voiced child jumping on and off the key like a chamois of the Alps leaping from crag to crag. Even the tough eggs liked it. At the end of the second refrain, the entire house was shouting for an encore, and the kid with the voice like a slate pencil took a deep breath and started to let it go once more. At this point, all the lights went out. I don't know when I've had anything so sudden and devastating happen to me before. They didn't flicker, they just went out. The hall was in complete darkness. Well, of course, that sort of broke the spell, as you might put it. People started to shout directions, and the tough eggs stamped their feet and settled down to a pleasant time. And of course young Bingo had to make an ass of himself. His voice suddenly shot at us out of the darkness. "Ladies and gentlemen, something has gone wrong with the lights." The tough eggs were tickled by this bit of information, straight from the stable. They took it up as a sort of battle cry. Then, after about 5 minutes, the lights went up again, and the show was resumed. It took 10 minutes after that to get the audience back into its state of coma, but eventually they began to settle down, and everything was going nicely, when a small boy with a face like a turbot edged out in front of the curtain, which had been lowered after a pretty painful scene about a wishing ring or a fairy's curse or something like that sort, and started to sing that song of George Dingammy's out of Cuddle Up. You know the one I mean. Always Listen to Mother, Girls, it's called, and he gets the audience to join in and sing the refrain. Quite a ripish ballad, and one which I myself have frequently sung in my bath with not a little vim, but by no means, as any one but a perfect saphead prune like young Bingo would have known, by no means the sort of thing for a children's Christmas entertainment in the old village hall. Right from the start of the first refrain, the bulk of the audience had begun to stiffen in their seats and fan themselves, and the Burgess girl at the piano was accompanying in a stunned, mechanical sort of way, while the curate at her side averted his gaze in a pained manner. The tough eggs, however, were all for it. At the end of the second refrain, the kids stopped and began to sidle towards the wings, upon which the following brief duologue took place. Young Bingo, voice heard off, ringing against the rafters. "Go on!" The kid, coyly. "I don't like to." Young Bingo, still louder. "Go on, you little blighter, or I'll slay you." I suppose the kid thought it over swiftly and realised that Bingo, being in a position to get at him, had better be conciliated whatever the harvest might be, for he shuffled down to the front and, having shut his eyes and giggled hysterically, said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I will now call upon Squire Tressida to oblige by singing the refrain." You know, with the most charitable feelings towards him, there are moments when you can't help thinking that young Bingo ought to be in some sort of home. I suppose, poor fish, he'd pictured this as the big punch of the evening. He'd imagined, I take it, that the squire would spring jovially to his feet, rip the song off his chest, and all would be gaiety and mirth. Well, what happened was simply that old Tressida, and mark you, I'm not blaming him, just sat where he was, swelling and turning a brighter purple every second. The lower middle classes remained in frozen silence, waiting for the roof to fall. The only section of the audience that really seems to enjoy the idea was the tough eggs, who yelled with enthusiasm. It was jam for the tough eggs. And then the lights went out again. When they went up some minutes later, they disclosed the squire marching stiffly out at the head of his family, fed up to the eyebrows, the Burgess girl at the piano with a pale, set look, and the curate gazing at her with something in his expression that seemed to suggest that, though all this was no doubt deplorable, he'd spotted the silver lining. The show went on once more. There were great chunks of plays for the tots dialogue, and then the girl in the piano struck the prelude to that Orange Girl number that's the big hit of the Palace Review. I took it that this was to be Bingo's smashing Act 1 finale. The entire company was on the stage, and a clutching hand had appeared round the edge of the curtain, ready to pull at the right moment. It looked like the finale, all right. It wasn't long before I realised it was something more. It was the finish. I take it you know that orange number at the Palace. It goes, "Oh, won't you something oranges, my something oranges, my something oranges, oh, won't you something I forget, something tumty yet, oh, words to that effect." It's a dashed clever lyric, and the tune's good too. The thing that made the number was the business where the girls take oranges out of the baskets, you know, and toss them lightly to the audience. I don't know if you ever noticed it, but it always seems to tickle an audience to bits when they get things thrown at them from the stage. Every time I've been to the Palace, the customers have simply gone wild over this number. But at the Palace, of course, the oranges are made of yellow wool, and the girls don't so much chuck them as drop them limply into the first and second rows. I began to gather that the business was going to be treated rather differently tonight, when a dashed great chunk of pips and mildew sailed past my ear and burst on the wall behind me. Another landed with a squelch on the neck of one of the nibs in the third row, and then a third took me right on the tip of the nose, and I kind of lost interest in the proceedings for a while. When I'd scrubbed my face and got my eye to stop watering for a moment, I saw that the evening's entertainment had begun to resemble one of Belfast's livelier nights, and the air was thick with shrieks and fruit. The kids on the stage, with Bingo buzzing distractedly to and fro in their midst, were having the time of their lives. I suppose they realised that this couldn't go on forever, and were making the most of their chances. The tough eggs had begun to pick up all the oranges that hadn't burst, and were shooting them back, so that the audience got it both coming and going. In fact, take it all round, there was a certain amount of confusion, and just as things had begun really to hot up, out went the lights again. It seemed to me about my time for leaving, so I slid for the door. I was hardly outside when the audience began to stream out. They surged about me in twos and threes, and I've never seen a public body so dashed unanimous on any point. To a man and to a woman they were cursing poor old Bingo, and there was a large and rapidly growing school of thought which held that the best thing to do would be to waylay him as he emerged and splash him about in the village pond a bit. There was such a dickens of a lot of these enthusiasts, and they looked so jolly determined that it seemed to me that the only matey thing to do was to go behind and warn young Bingo to turn his coat collar up and breeze off snakily by some side exit. I went behind and found him sitting on a box in the wings, perspiring pretty freely and looking more or less like the spot marked with a cross where the accident happened. His hair was standing up and his ears were hanging down, and one harsh word would undoubtedly have made him burst into tears. "Bertie," he said hollowly as he saw me, "it was that blighter Steggles. I caught one of the kids before he could get away, and got it all out of him. Steggles substituted real oranges for the balls of wool, which with infinite sweat and at a cost of nearly a quid I had specially prepared. Well, I will now proceed to tear him limb from limb. It'll be something to do." I hated to spoil his daydreams, but it had to be. "Good heavens, man," I said, "you haven't time for frivolous amusements now. You've got to get out, and quick." "Bertie," said Bingo in a dull voice, "she was here just now. She said it was all my fault, and that she would never speak to me again. She said she'd always suspected me of being a heartless, practical joker, and now she knew. She said, oh, well, she ticked me off properly." "That's the least of your troubles," I said. It seemed impossible to rouse the poor Zib to a sense of his position. "Do you realise that about 200 of Twing's heftiest are waiting for you outside to chuck you into the pond?" "No." "Absolutely." For a moment the poor chap seemed crushed, but only for a moment. There has always been something of the good old English bulldog breed about Bingo. A strange, sweet smile flickered for an instant over his face. "It's all right," he said. "I can sneak out through the cellar and climb over the wall at the back. They can't intimidate me." It couldn't have been more than a week later when Jeeves, after he had bought me my tea, gently steered me away from the sporting page of the Morning Post and directed my attention to an announcement in the engagements and marriages column. It was a brief statement that a marriage had been arranged and would shortly take place between the Honourable and Reverend Hubert Wingham, third son of the Right Honourable the Earl of Sturridge, and Mary, only daughter of the late Matthew Burgess of Weatherly Court, Hants. "Of course," I said, after I'd given it the east to west. "I expected this, Jeeves." "Yes, sir." "She would never forgive him what happened that night." "No, sir." "Well," I said, as I took a sip of the fragrant and steaming, "I don't suppose it will take old Bingo long to get over it. It's about the 111th time this sort of thing has happened to him. You're the man I'm sorry for." "Me, sir?" "Well, dash it all, you can't have forgotten what a deuce of a lot of trouble you took to bring the thing off for Bingo. It's too bad that all your work should have been wasted." "Not entirely wasted, sir." "Eh?" "It is true that my efforts to bring about the match between Mr. Little and the young lady were not successful. But still, I look back upon the matter with a certain satisfaction." "Because you did your best, you mean?" "Not entirely, sir. Of course, that thought also gives me pleasure. I was alluding more particularly to the fact that I found the affair financially remunerative." "Financially remunerative? What do you mean?" When I learned that Mr. Steggles had interested himself in the contest, sir, I went shares with my friend Brookfield, and bought the book which had been made on the issue by the landlord of the Cow and Horses. It has proved a highly profitable investment. Your breakfast will be ready almost immediately, sir. Kidneys on toast, and mushrooms. I will bring it when you ring. End of chapter 20. Recording by Chapter 21 of Wodehouse in the Strand, Short Story Collection. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gordon Mackay. Wodehouse in the Strand Short Story Collection by Pelham Grenville Wodehouse. Chapter 21, The Purity of the Turf. When the thing was over, I made my mind up. "Jeeves," I said. "Sir?" "Never again. The strain is too great. I don't say I shall chuck betting altogether. If I get hold of a good thing for one of the big races, no doubt I shall have my bit on it aforetime, but you won't catch me mixing myself up with one of these minor country meetings again. They're too hot." "I think perhaps you are right, sir," said Jeeves. It was young Bingo Little who lured me into the thing. About the third week of my visit at Twing Hall, he blew into my bedroom one morning while I was toying with a bit of breakfast, and thinking of this and that. "Batty," he said, in an earnest kind of voice. I decided to take a firm line from the start. Young Bingo, if you remember, was at a pretty low ebb at about this juncture. He'd not only failed to put his finances on a sound basis over the recent sermon handicap, but had also discovered that Cynthia Wick loved another. These things had jarred the unfortunate mutt, and he developed a habit of dropping in at me at all hours and decanting his anguished soul on me. I could stand this all right after dinner, and even after lunch, but before breakfast, no. We Worcesters are amiability itself, but there is a limit. "Now look here, old friend," I said. "I know your bally heart is broken and all that, and at some future time I shall be delighted to hear all about it, but—" "I didn't come to talk about that." "No? Good egg." "The past," said young Bingo, "is dead. Let's say no more about it." "Righto." "I have been wounded to the very depths of my soul, but don't speak about it." "I won't." "Ignore it. Forget it." "Absolutely." I hadn't seen him so dashed reasonable for weeks. "What I came to see you about this morning, Bertie," he said, fishing a sheet of paper out of his pocket, "was to ask if you would care to come in on another little flutter. If there is one thing we Worcesters are simply dripping with, it is sporting blood." I bolted the rest of my sausage and sat up and took notice. "Proceed," I said. "You interest me strangely, old bird." Bingo laid the paper on the bed. "On Monday week," he said, "you may or may not know the annual village school treat takes place. Lord Wick Hammersley lends the hall grounds for the purpose. There will be games, and a conjurer, and coconut shies, and tea in a tent, and also sports." "I know. Cynthia was telling me." Young Bingo winced. "Would you mind not mentioning that name?" he said. "I'm not made of marble. Sorry. Well, as I was saying, this jamboree is slated for Monday week. The question is, are we on?" "How do you mean, are we on?" "I am referring to the sports. Steggles did so well out of the sermon handicap that he's decided to make a book on these sports. Punters can be accommodated at ante-post odds or starting price, according to their preference. Steggles, I don't know if you remember, was one of the gang of youths who were reading for some examination or other with old Heppenstall down at the vicarage. He was the fellow who'd promoted the sermon handicap, a bird of considerable enterprise and vast riches, being the only son of one of the biggest bookies in London, but no pal of mine. I never liked the chap. He was a ferret-faced egg with a shifty eye and not a few pimples. On the whole, a nasty growth. "I think we ought to look into it," said young Bingo. I pressed the bell. "I'll consult Jeeves. I don't touch any sporting proposition without his advice. Jeeves," I said as he drifted in, "rally round." "Sir?" "Stand by. We want your advice." "Very good, sir." "State your case, Bingo." Bingo stated his case. "What about it, Jeeves?" I said. "Do we go in?" Jeeves pondered to some extent. "I am inclined to favour the idea, sir." That was good enough for me. "Right," I said. "Then we will form a syndicate and bust the ring. I supply the money, you supply the brains, and Bingo— What do you supply, Bingo?" "If you'll carry me and let me settle up later," said young Bingo, "I think we can put you in a way of winning parcel on the Mother's Suck race." "All right. We'll put you down as inside information. Now, what are the events?" Bingo reached for his paper and consulted it. "Girls under 14, 50-yard dash seems to open the proceedings." "Anything to say about that, Jeeves?" "No, sir, I have no information." "What's the next?" "Boys and girls mixed animal potato race, all ages." This was a new one to me. I'd never heard of it at any of the big meetings. "What's that?" "Rather sporting," said young Bingo. "The competitors enter in couples, each couple being assigned an animal cry and a potato. For instance, let's suppose that you and Jeeves entered. Jeeves would stand at a fixed point holding a potato. You would have your head in a sack, and you would grope about trying to find Jeeves and making a noise like a cat. Jeeves also making a noise like a cat. Other competitors would be making noises like cows and pigs and dogs and so on, and groping about for their potato holders, who would also be making noises like cows and pigs and dogs and so on." I stopped the poor fish. "Jolly if you're fond of animals," I said, "but on the whole—" "Precisely, sir," said Jeeves. "I wouldn't touch it. Too open, what?" "Exactly, sir. Very hard to estimate form." "Carry on, Bingo. Where do we go from there?" "Mother's Sack race." "Ah, that's better. This is where you know something." "A gift for Mrs. Penworthy, the tobacconist's wife," said Bingo confidently. "I was in at her shop yesterday buying cigarettes, and she told me she'd won 3 times at fairs in Worcestershire. She only moved to these parts a short time ago, so nobody knows about her. She promised me she'd keep herself dark, and I think we could get a good price." "Risk a tenner each way, Jeeves, what?" "I think so, sir." "Girls, open egg and spoon race," said Bingo. "How about that?"
"I doubt it would be worth while to invest, sir. I'm told it is a certainty for last year's winner, Sarah Mills, who will doubtless start an odds-on favourite."
"Good, is she?"
"They tell me in the village that she carries a beautiful egg, sir."
"Then there's the obstacle race," said Bingo. "Risky, in my opinion, like betting on the Grand National. Father's hat-trimming contest, another speculative event. That's all, except the choir boy's 100 yards handicap for a pewter mug presented by the vicar, open to all whose voices have not broken before the second Sunday in Epiphany. Willie Chambers won last year in a canter, receiving 15 yards. This time he'll probably be handicapped out of the race. I don't know what to advise."
"If I might make a suggestion, sir?"
I eyed Jeeves with interest. I don't know that I'd ever seen him look so nearly excited. "You've got something up your sleeve?"
"I have, sir."
"Red hot?"
"That precisely describes it, sir. I think I may confidently assert that we have the winner of the choir boy's handicap under this very roof, sir. Harold, the page boy."
"Page boy? Do you mean the tubby little chap in buttons one sees bobbing about here and there? Why, dash it, Jeeves, nobody has a greater respect for your knowledge of form than I have, but I'm hanged if I can see Harold catching the judge's eye. He's practically circular, and every time I've seen him he's been leaning up against something half asleep."
"He receives 30 yards, sir, and could win from scratch. The boy is a flyer."
"How do you know?"
Jeeves coughed, and there was a dreamy look in his eye. "I was as much astonished as yourself, sir. when I first became aware of the lad's capabilities. I happened to pursue him one morning with the intention of fetching him a clip on the side of the head. "Great Scott, Jeeves! You?" "Yes, sir. The boy is of an outspoken disposition, and had made an opprobrious remark respecting my personal appearance." "What did he say about your appearance?" "I have forgotten, sir," said Jeeves, with a touch of austerity, "but it was opprobrious. I endeavoured to correct him, but he outdistanced me by yards, and made good his escape." "But I say, Jeeves, this is sensational. And yet, if he's such a sprinter, why hasn't anybody in the village found out? Surely he plays with the other boys." "No, sir. As his lordship's page boy, Harold does not mix with the village lads. Bit of a snob, what? He is somewhat acutely alive to the existence of class distinctions, sir." "You're absolutely certain he's such a wonder?" said Bingo. "I mean, wouldn't do to plunge, unless you're sure." "If you desire to ascertain the boy's form by personal inspection, sir, it will be a simple matter to arrange a secret trial." "I'm bound to say I should feel easier in my mind," I said. "Then, if I may take a shilling from the money on your dressing-table, what for?" "I propose to bribe the lad to speak slightingly of the second footman's squint, sir. Charles is somewhat sensitive on the point, and should undoubtedly make the lad extend himself. If you will be at the first floor passage window overlooking the back door in half an hour's time." "I don't know when I've dressed in such a hurry. As a rule, I'm what you might call a slow and careful dresser. I like to linger over the tie and see that the trousers are just so, but this morning I was all worked up. I just shoved on my things anyhow and joined Bingo at the window with a quarter of an hour to spare." The passage window looked down onto a broad sort of paved courtyard, which ended after about 20 yards in an archway through a high wall. Beyond this archway you got on to a strip of the drive, which curved round for another 30 yards or so till it was lost behind a thick shrubbery. I put myself in the stripling's place and thought what steps I would take with the second footman after me. There was only one thing to do: leg it for the shrubbery and take cover, which meant that at least 50 yards would have to be covered, an excellent test. If good old Harold could fight off the second footman's challenge long enough to allow him to reach the bushes, there wasn't a choir boy in England who could give him 30 yards in the 100. I waited all of a twitter for what seemed hours, and then suddenly there was a confused noise without, and something round and blue and buttony shot through the back door and buzzed for the archway like a mustang. And about 2 seconds later out came the second footman, going his hardest. There was nothing to it, absolutely nothing. The field never had a chance. Long before the footman reached the half-way mark, Harold was in the bushes, throwing stones. I came away from the window thrilled to the marrow, and when I met Jeeves on the stairs I was so moved that I nearly grasped his hand. "Jeeves," I said, "no discussion. The Worcester shirt goes on this boy." "Very good, sir," said Jeeves. The worst of these country meetings is that you can't plunge as heavily as you would like when you get a good thing, because it alarms the ring. Steggles, though pimpled, was, as I have indicated, no chump, and if I had invested all I wanted to, he would have put 2 and 2 together. I managed to get a good solid bet down for the syndicate, however, though it did make him look thoughtful. I heard in the next few days that he'd been making searching inquiries in the village concerning Harold, but nobody could tell him anything, and eventually he came to the conclusion, I suppose, that I must be having a long shot on the strength of that 30-yard start. Public opinion wavered between Jimmy Good receiving 10 yards at 7-2, and Alexander Bartlett with 6 yards start at 11-4. Willie Chambers' scratch was offered to the public at 2-1, but found no takers. We were taking no chances on the big event, and directly we'd got our money on at a nice 100-12, Harold was put into strict training. It was a wearing business, and I can understand now why most of the big trainers are grim, silent men who look as though they have suffered. The kid wanted constant watching. It was no good talking to him about honour and glory and how proud his mother would be when he wrote and told her he'd won a real cup. The moment blighted Harold discovered that training meant knocking off pastry, taking exercise and keeping away from the cigarettes, he was all against it, and it was only by unceasing vigilance that we managed to keep him in any shape at all. It was the diet that was the stumbling block. As far as exercise went, we could generally arrange for a sharp dash every morning with the assistance of the second footman. It ran into money, of course, but that couldn't be helped. Still, when a kid has simply to wait till the butler's back is turned to have the run of the pantry, and has only to nip into the smoking room to collect a handful of the best Turkish, training becomes a rocky job. We could only hope that on the day his natural stamina would pull him through. And then, one evening, young Bingo came back from the links with a disturbing story. He'd been in the habit of giving Harold mild exercise in the afternoons by taking him out as a caddie. At first he seemed to think it humorous, the poor chump. He bubbled over with merry mirth as he began his tale. "I say, rather funny this afternoon," he said. "You ought to have seen Steggles' face." "Seen Steggles' face? What for?" "When he saw young Harold sprint, I mean." I was filled with a grim foreboding of an awful doom. "Good heavens! You didn't let Harold sprint in front of Steggles?" Young Bingo's jaw dropped. I never thought of that," he said gloomily. "It wasn't my fault. I was playing around with Steggles, and after we'd finished we went into the clubhouse for a drink, leaving Harold with the clubs outside. In about 5 minutes we came out, and there was the kid on the gravel practising swings with Steggles' driver and a stone. When he saw us coming, the kid dropped the club and was over the horizon like a streak. Steggles was absolutely dumbfounded, and I must say it was a revelation even to me. The kid certainly gave of his best. Of course it's a nuisance in a way, but I don't see—" "On second thoughts," said Bingo, brightening up, "what it matters. We're on at a good price, with nothing to lose by the kid's form becoming known. I take it he will start odds on, but that doesn't affect us." I looked at Jeeves. Jeeves looked at me. "It affects us all right if he doesn't start at all." "Precisely, sir." "What do you mean?" asked Bingo. "If you ask me," I said, "I think Steggles will try to nobble him before the race." "Good Lord! I never thought of that." Bingo blenched. "You don't think he would really do it?" "I think he would have a jolly good try. Steggles is a bad man. From now on, Jeeves, we must watch Harold like hawks." "Undoubtedly, sir." "Ceaseless vigilance, what?" "Precisely, sir." "You wouldn't care to sleep in his room, Jeeves?" "No, sir, I should not." "No, nor would I if it comes to that. But dash it all," I said, "we're letting ourselves get rattled. We're losing our nerve. This won't do. How can Steggles possibly get at Harold, even if he wants to?" There was no cheering young Bingo up. He's one of those birds who simply leap at the morbid view if you give him half a chance. "There are all sorts of ways of nobbling favourites," he said, in a sort of deathbed voice. "You ought to read some of these racing novels. In Pipped on the Post, Lord Jasper Mauleverer, as near as a toucher, outed Bonnie Betsy by bribing the head lad to slip a cobra into a stable the night before the Derby. What are the chances of a cobra biting Harold, Jeeves?" "Slight, I should imagine, sir, and in such an event Knowing the boy as intimately as I do, my anxiety would be entirely for the snake. Still, unceasing vigilance, Jeeves. Most certainly, sir. I must say I got a bit fed with young Bingo in the next few days. It's all very well for a fellow with a big winner in his stable to exercise proper care, but in my opinion Bingo overdid it. The blighter's mind appeared to be absolutely saturated with racing fiction, and in stories of that kind, as far as I could make out, no horse is ever allowed to start in a race without at least a dozen attempts to put it out of action. He stuck to Harold like a plaster, never let the unfortunate kid out of his sight. Of course, it meant a lot to the poor old egg if he could collect on this race, because it would give him enough money to chuck his tutoring job and get back to London. But all the same, he needn't have woken me up at 3 in the morning, twice running, once to tell me we ought to cook Harold's food ourselves to prevent doping, the other time to say that he'd heard mysterious noises in the shrubbery. But he reached the limit, in my opinion, when he insisted on my going to evening service on Sunday, the day before the sports. "Why on earth?" I said, never being much of a lad for evensong. "Well, I can't go myself. I shan't be here. I've got to go to London to-day with young Egbert." Egbert was Lord Wickham-Ashley's son, the one Bingo was tutoring. "He's going for a visit down in Kent, and I've got to see him off at Charing Cross. It's an infernal nuisance. I shan't be back till Monday afternoon. In fact, I shall miss most of the sports, I expect. Everything, therefore, depends on you, Bertie." "But why should either of us go to evening service?" "Us? Harold sings in the choir, doesn't he?" "What about it? I can't stop him dislocating his neck over a high note, if that's what you're afraid of." "Fool! Steggles sings in the choir too. There may be dirty work after the service." "What absolute rot!" "Is it?" said young Bingo. "Well, let me tell you that in Jenny the Girl Jockey the villain kidnapped the boy who was to ride the favourite the night before the big race, and he was the only one who understood and could control the horse. And if the heroine hadn't dressed up in riding things and—" "Oh, all right, all right. But if there's any danger, it seems to me the simplest thing would be for Harold not to turn out on Sunday evening." "He must turn out. You seem to think the infernal kid is a monument of rectitude, beloved by all. He's got the shakiest reputation of any kid in the village. His name is as near being mud as it can jolly well stick. He's played hooky from the choir so often that the vicar told him if one more thing happened he would fire him out. Nice chumps we should look if he was scratched the night before the race." Well, of course, that being so, there was nothing for it but to toddle along. There's something about evening service in a country church that makes a fellow feel drowsy and peaceful, sort of end of a perfect day feeling. Old Heppenstall, the vicar, was up in the pulpit, and he has a kind of regular bleating delivery that assists thought. They'd left the door open, and the air was full of a mixed scent of trees and honeysuckle and mildew and villagers' Sunday clothes. As far as the eye could reach, you could see farmers propped up in restful attitudes, breathing heavily, and the children in the congregation who had fidgeted during the earlier part of the proceedings were now lying back in a surfeited sort of coma. The last rays of the setting sun shone through the stained-glass windows. Birds were twittering in the trees. The women's dresses crackled gently in the stillness. Peaceful. That's what I'm driving at. I felt peaceful. Everybody felt peaceful. And that is why the explosion, when it came, sounded like the end of all things. I call it an explosion because that was what it seemed like when it broke loose. One moment a dreamy hush was all over the place, broken only by old Heppenstall talking about our duty to our neighbours, and then suddenly a sort of piercing, shrieking squeal that got you right between the eyes and ran all the way down your spine and out at the soles of the feet. "Ee! Oo! Ee! Ee!" It sounded like about 600 pigs having their tails twisted simultaneously, but it was simply the kid, Harold, who appeared to be having some species of fit. He was jumping up and down and slapping at the back of his neck, and about every other second he would take a deep breath and give out another of the squeals. Well, I mean, you can't do that sort of thing in the middle of the sermon during evening service without exciting remark. The congregation came out of its trance with a jerk and climbed on the pews to get a better view. Old Heppenstall stopped in the middle of a sentence and spun round, and a couple of vergers with great presence of mind bounded up the aisle like leopards, collected Harold, still squealing, and marched him out. They disappeared into the vestry, and I grabbed my hat and legged it round to the stage door, full of apprehension and what not. I couldn't think what the deuce could have happened, but somewhere, dimly behind the proceedings, there seemed to me to lurk the hand of the blighter, Steggles. By the time I got there, and managed to get someone to open the door, which was locked, the service seemed to be over. Old Heppenstall was standing in the middle of a crowd of choir boys and vergers and sextons and what not, putting the wretched Harold through it with no little vim. I'd come in at the tail end of what must have been a fairly fruity oration. "Wretched boy, how dare you? I got sensitive skin. This is no time to talk about your skin. Somebody put a beetle down my back. Absurd. I felt it wriggling. Nonsense." "Sounds pretty thin, doesn't it?" said someone at my side. It was Steggles, dash him, clad in a snowy surplice or cassock or whatever they call it, and wearing an expression of grave concern. The blighter had the cold, cynical crust to look me in the eyeball without a blink. "Did you put the beetle down his neck?" I cried. "Me?" said Steggles. "Me?" Old Heppenstall was putting on the black cap. "I do not credit a word of your story, wretched boy. I have warned you before, and now the time has come to act. You cease from this moment to be a member of my choir. Go, miserable child." Steggles plucked at my sleeve. "In that case," he said, "those bets, you know, I'm afraid you lose your money, dear old boy. It's a pity you didn't put it on SP. I always think SP is the only safe way." I gave him one look. Not a bit of good, of course. "And they talk about the purity of the turf," I said, and I meant it to sting, by Jove. Jeeves received the news bravely, but I think the man was a bit rattled beneath the service. "An ingenious young gentleman, Mr. Steggles, sir." "A bally swindler, you mean?" "Perhaps that would be a more exact description. However, these things will happen on the turf, and it is useless to complain. I wish I had your sunny disposition, Jeeves." Jeeves bowed. "We now rely, then, it would seem, sir, almost entirely on Mrs. Penworthy. Should she justify Mr. Little's encomiums and show real class in the mother's sac-race, our gains will just balance our losses." "Yes, but that's not much consolation when you've been looking forward to a big win." "It is just possible that we may still find ourselves on the right side of the ledger after all, sir. Before Mr. Little left, I persuaded him to invest a small sum for the syndicate, of which you were kind enough to make me a member, sir, on the girls' egg and spoon race." "On Sarah Mills?" "No, sir, on a long-priced outsider. Little Prudence Baxter, sir, the child of his lordship's head gardener. Her father assures me she has a very steady hand. She is accustomed to bring him his mug of beer from the cottage each afternoon, and he informs me she has never spilled a drop." Well, that sounded as though young Prudence's control was good, but how about speed? With seasoned performers like Sarah Mills entered, the thing practically amounted to a classic race, and at these big events you must have speed. "I am aware that it is what is termed a long shot, sir. Still, I thought it judicious." "You backed her for a place, too, of course?" "Yes, sir, each way." "Well, I suppose it's all right. Never known you make a bloomer yet." "Thank you very much, sir." I'm bound to say that, as a general rule, my idea of a large afternoon would be to keep as far away from a village school treat as possible. A sticky business, but with such grave issues toward, if you know what I mean, I sank my prejudice on this occasion and rolled up. I found the proceedings about as scaly as I had expected. It was a warm day, and the hall's grounds were a dense, practically liquid mass of peasantry. Kids seethed to and fro. One of them, a small girl of sorts, grabbed my hand and hung on to it as I clove my way through the jam to where the mother's sack race was to finish. We hadn't been introduced, but she seemed to think that I would do as well as anyone else to talk to about the rag doll she'd won in the lucky dip, and she rather spread herself on the topic. "I'm going to call it Gertrude," she said, "and I shall undress it every night and put it to bed and wake it up in the morning and dress it and put it to bed at night and wake it up next morning and dress it." "I say, old thing," I said, "I don't want to hurry you and all that, but you couldn't condense it a bit, could you? I'm rather anxious to see the finish of this race. The Worcester fortunes are by way of hanging on it." "I'm going to run in a race soon," she said, shelving the doll for the nonce and descending to ordinary chit-chat. "Yes," I said, distrait, if you know what I mean, and trying to peer through the cheeks of the crowd. "What race is that?" "Egg and spoon." "No, really. Are you Sarah Mills?" "No," registering scorn. "I'm Prudence Baxter." Naturally, this put our relations on a different footing. I gazed at her with considerable interest. One of the stable, I must say. She didn't look much of a flyer. She was short and round. A bit out of condition, I thought. "I say," I said, "that being so, you mustn't dash about in the hot sun and take the edge off yourself. You must conserve your energies, old friend. Sit down, here in the shade." "I don't want to sit down." "Well, take it easy, anyhow." The kid flitted to another topic, like a butterfly hovering from flower to flower. "I'm a good girl," she said. "I bet you are. I hope you're a good egg and spoon racer too." "Harold's a bad boy. Harold squealed in church and isn't allowed to come to the treat. I'm glad," continued this ornament of her sex, wrinkling her nose virtuously, "because he's a bad boy. He pulled my hair Friday. Harold isn't coming to the treat. Harold isn't coming to the treat. Harold isn't coming to the treat," she chanted, making a regular song of it. "Don't rub it in, my dear old gardener's daughter," I pleaded. "You don't know it, but you've hit on rather a painful subject." "Ah, Worcester, my dear fellow. So, you've made friends with this little lady?" It was old Heppenstall, beaming pretty profusely, life and soul of the party. "I am delighted, my dear Worcester," he went on, "quite delighted at the way you young men are throwing yourselves into the spirit of this little festivity of ours." "Oh, yes," I said. "Oh, yes. Even Rupert Steggles. I must confess that my opinion of Rupert Steggles has materially altered for the better this afternoon. Mine hadn't, but I didn't say so. I'd always considered Rupert Steggles, between ourselves, a rather self-centred youth, by no means the kind who would put himself out to further the enjoyment of his fellows, and yet twice within the last half-hour I have observed him escorting Mrs. Penworthy, our worthy tobacconist's wife, to the refreshment tent. I left him standing. I shook off the clutching hand of the Baxter kid and hared it rapidly to the spot where the mother's sack race was just finishing. I had a horrid presentiment that there had been more dirty work at the crossroads. The first person I ran into was young Bingo. I grabbed him by the arm. "Who won?" "I don't know. I didn't notice." There was bitterness in the chappie's voice. "It wasn't Mrs. Penworthy, Dasher. Bertie, that hound Steggles is nothing more nor less than one of our leading snakes. I don't know how he heard about her, but he must have got on to it that she was dangerous. Do you know what he did? he lured that miserable woman into the refreshment tent 5 minutes before the race, and brought her out so weighed down with cake and tea that she blew up in the first 20 yards, just rolled over and lay there. Well, thank goodness we still have Harold." I gaped at the poor chump. "Harold? Haven't you heard?" "Heard?" Bingo turned a delicate green. "Heard what? I haven't heard anything. I only arrived 5 minutes ago. Came here, straight from the station. What's happened? Tell me." I slipped him the information. He stared at me for a moment in a ghastly sort of way, then, with a hollow groan, tottered away and was lost in the crowd. A nasty knock, poor chap. I didn't blame him for being upset. They were clearing the decks now for the egg and spoon race, and I thought I might as well stay where I was and watch the finish. Not that I had much hope. Young Prudence was a good conversationalist, but she didn't seem to me to be the build for a winner. As far as I could see, through the mob, they got off to a good start. A short, red-haired child was making the running, with a freckled blonde second and Sarah Mills lying up an easy third. Our nominee was straggling along with the field, well behind the leaders. It was not hard, even as early as this, to spot the winner. There was a grace, a practised precision, in the way Sarah Mills held a spoon that told its own story. She was cutting out a good pace, but her egg didn't even wobble. A natural egg and spooner if ever there was one. Class will tell. 30 yards from the tape, the red-haired kid tripped over her feet and shot her egg onto the turf. The freckled blonde fought gamely, but she'd run herself out halfway down the straight, and Sarah Mills came past and home on a tight rein by several lengths, a popular winner. The blonde was second. A sniffing female in the blue gingham beat a pie-faced kid in pink for the place money, and Prudence Baxter, Jeeves's long shot, was either fifth or sixth, I couldn't see which. And then I was carried along with the crowd to where old Heppenstall was going to present the prizes. I found myself standing next to the man Steggles. "Hello, old chap," he said, very bright and cheery. "You've had a bad day, I'm afraid." I looked at him with silent scorn. Lost on the blighter, of course. "It's not been a good meeting for any of the big punters," he went on. "Poor old Bingo Little went down badly over that egg and spoon race." I hadn't been meaning to chat with the fellow, but I was startled. "How do you mean, badly?" I said. He only had a small bet on." "I don't know what you call small. He had 30 quid each way on the Baxter kid." The landscape reeled before me. "What?" 30 quid, at 10 to 1. I thought he must have heard something, but apparently not. The race went by the form book all right. I was trying to do sums in my head. I was just in the middle of working out the syndicate's losses when old Heppenstall's voice came sort of faintly to me out of the distance. He'd been pretty fatherly and debonair when ladling out the prizes for the other events, but now he had suddenly grown all pained and grieved. He peered sorrowfully at the multitude. "With regard to the girls' egg and spoon race, which has just concluded," he said, "I have a painful duty to perform. Circumstances have arisen which it is impossible to ignore. It is not too much to say that I am stunned." He gave the populace about 5 seconds to wonder why he was stunned, then went on. 3 years ago, as you are aware, I was compelled to expunge from the lists of events at this annual festival the Father's Quarter Mile, owing to reports coming to my ears of wagers taken and given on the result at the village inn, and a strong suspicion that on at least one occasion the race had actually been sold by the speediest runner. That unfortunate occurrence shook my faith in human nature, I admit, but still, there was one event at least which I confidently expected to remain untainted by the miasma of professionalism. I allude to the girls' egg and spoon race. It seems, alas, that I was too sanguine." He stopped again, and wrestled with his feelings. "I will not weary you with the unpleasant details. I will merely say that before the race was run, a stranger in our midst, the manservant of one of the guests at the hall, I will not specify with more particularity, approached several of the competitors and presented each of them with 5 shillings, on condition that they finished. A belated sense of remorse has led him to confess to me what he did. But it is too late. The evil is accomplished, and retribution must take its course. It's no time for half measures. I must be firm. I rule that Sarah Mills, Jane Parker, Bessie Clay, and Rosie Jukes, the first 4 to pass the winning post, have forfeited their amateur status and are disqualified. And this handsome work-bag, presented by Lord Wickhammersley, goes in consequence to Prudence Baxter. Prudence, step forward. End of chapter 21. Recording by Gordon Mackay, Urton Hall, Holmrook, Cumbria. End of Wodehouse in the Strand, short